Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Jump On Air. We're so happy you've chosen to spend some of your Wednesday with us as we talk about statistics, science, data, and of course, Jump. My name is Julian Paris. I am the Learning Strategy Manager here at Jump Software. And as always, I get the privilege of being your host for Jump On Air. We have a very special show for you today because today, as you probably know, is Earth Day. And so our Earth Day broadcast is going to be packed full of great speakers who are sharing stories with you and knowledge with you. And we're so happy to have you on our program to be a part of that. So I'm going to show a schedule throughout today to make sure that I keep us on track as best as possible. You'll see we have a packed schedule, so I'm going to do my best to keep us on to the minute. But of course, things will change a little bit, but I'll, do my best. Now, if you do get disconnected or if you have to go and need to come back, remember the one link you need is jump.com/jumponair. That'll reconnect you right back to our live stream. So even if you have to go up to the kitchen to get that snack, go on a run, take us with you, jump.com/jumponair. One additional link I'll share with you again is community.jump.com/jumponair. This is where you can get links to any of the resources we mentioned during the broadcast. This is where you can watch all the on-demand videos, the full episode, any of the segments you see. The link to remember is community.jump.com/jumponair. Now, because it's Earth Day, there's one final thing I want to share with you, which is jump.com/forward. And that's a link to get the Jump Forward magazine that we develop here right at Jump. It has so many great stories in it, so many great articles, and there's some that are especially relevant to Earth Day. So I invite you to go to jump.com/forward. I don't believe we're shipping out the magazines right now, but you can get the PDF right now, and you can come back and get the actual print magazine later at another time. Now, I always like to start off our show with a little bit of a segment. I don't want to take any of the thunder away from any of the science or any of the technical talks, and so I like to keep these a little bit light. Now, I was thinking, what would be relevant for Earth Day? And so I wanted to feature something that was nature-focused. And I came across an interesting thing. So there's this farm, the Sweet Farm out in Half Moon Bay, California. Some of you may have heard about this place because they now do something quite interesting, which is they can have a goat or a llama call into your broadcast, your Zoom meeting, your Teams meeting, whatever meeting you have. And if you asked me a year ago if we'd be having farm animals dial into our video conferences, I would think you were crazy. But this is a thing apparently we're doing now, so welcome to the new reality. Unfortunately, all the goats were unavailable. There was no llamas, no chickens, so we don't have any of them coming to our show today. There was one other option I looked into, which is the Piedmont Animal Center will have an owl dial into your show. I'm also sorry to report that there are no owls available for this broadcast. But if you're interested in having an owl or a farm animal come to your next meeting, definitely check these out. I'll put the links actually on the segment pages. So I started thinking about what else to talk about. So I think I'm going to do this segment, Stranger Than Expected, where we talk about normal things that aren't what you imagined. And actually, the impetus for this particular segment, Growing Our Food, came about 4 years ago, or a little bit more than 4 years ago. And it came about on the first date with a person who I would end up marrying, who told me that cashews grow in a really bizarre way. Now, I'm going to share with you how cashews grow in a little bit, but I want to talk through some other foods that grow in strange ways you wouldn't have expected. We all know asparagus, great food. I actually had it last night with my partner. It does not grow in the way you would expect. It actually grows in the way you would expect somebody to prank you if they were telling you that's how it grew. So asparagus just grows straight out of the dirt like that, just like you shove them in there. That's pretty weird. Stranger than expected. Almonds, something we've all had, delicious. I grew up in California, so we were known for almonds. I actually didn't know that they grow in this strange way. They actually grow in these furry husks that in late July or August start to break open and the almond inside dries out. Stranger than expected. Chestnuts, which are already, honestly, to me, stranger than I would expect, grow in these prickly husks that I guess keep animals away from eating the delicious insides. Peanuts, you might think, grow on trees. In fact, no, they grow under the dirt. They are in their pods under the dirt there, which is a really interesting way for them to grow. So they pull them up in these bunches. Pineapples, also stranger than expected, grow not in trees. Like, honestly, I'm a little embarrassed to say I thought. They grow on the ground just out of these little bushes. Artichokes, also stranger than expected. They have actual beautiful little flowers that will grow if you allow them to bloom. And then finally, our cashews, the last one I wanted to tell you, and the first one I told you about, grow in perhaps the strangest thing you might expect, which is on the end of this fruiting body. So every cashew you've had Hasn't grown in a pod, hasn't grown underground. No, it's grown on the end of this little fruiting body, individually picked for your delicious consumption. So cashews and all these other fruits, certainly stranger than expected. All right, so now into the real content. We have, like I said, a wonderful show for you full of great speakers. And our first, I'm really excited to introduce, is John Sall. He's the co-founder and executive vice president of Sas, the creator of JMP software. And he's going to talk to us today about supply and demand for carbon pricing. So, John Sall.
Am I on, Julian?
You are, John. Thanks.
Okay. Let's see. I need to share my screen. So does that work? And share. There.
Perfect. We're seeing it.
Okay, well, happy Earth Day to everyone. I remember Earth Day. I'm old enough to remember Earth Day, and it made quite an impression on me and really shaped a lot of things that I've done over the years. So today's topic is fossil carbon pricing policy. And a bit of a background that I've spent some time on this. I spent a lot of time with organizations. I was on the global board of Nature Conservancy and now on the board of the U.S. World Wildlife Fund. I've been active in a number of other groups and supporting them, all environmental groups. I started getting interested in pricing policy when we had some of the congressional proposals and bills come up back in the 2000s. So there was the Mccain-Lieberman Client Stewardship Act, 2003 to 2007. And then there was the Waxman-Markey American Clean Energy and Security Act that actually passed the House, did not pass the Senate. And that was the subject of a lot of great studies. Congressional Budget Office and others did. And it was a cap and trade bill. And I started wondering, well, is cap and trade really the way to go? It certainly seemed to work in the age of sulfur dioxide regulations 20 years earlier. But then I read an article by David Brooks in the New York Times that talked about or contrasted cap and trade with carbon tax. And really, I started listening to the economists speak on this issue, and they really strongly favored the carbon tax, as you'll see in a minute. And I started reading books about it, Carbonomics, and then started listening to some of the people in Congress. And last year, I started listening to the Climate Caucus and the Curbelo bill that was led by the chairman of the Climate Caucus. Well, that was several years ago, actually. Now. And then there's a new book out that I highly recommend, Paying for Pollution, Why a Carbon Tax is Good for America by Gilbert Metcalf. And that's really the best book. It just came out a few months ago, and that's what I recommend. So why do I think a carbon tax is good? Well, first, it's a Pigou tax, which is an old established idea. And so if you bring up Pigovian tax, it's a tax on any market activity that generates negative externalities, costs not included in the market price, and it's intended to correct an undesirable or inefficient market outcome or market failure by being set equal to the social cost of those negative externalities. So it's really a fix-up for costs that are not being paid but by the supplier, but being paid socially by everyone, and not incorporated in the supply and demand curve for that market. So carbon tax is old and simple. It's also practical. It's paid very upstream, applied near the source of production, where you tax the coal companies and the oil companies that are producing fossil carbon that have a direct effect on carbon emission, CO2 emissions. And you don't have to measure the emissions themselves. You can measure the fuel that make the emissions. It turns out a carbon tax is very economically efficient and lets the markets work for what they do well, and then fixes up with the tax for what the markets fail on. And it does not necessitate creating derivative markets like cap and trade does, which basically sells permits and gives a derivative market in carbon emission permit trading. It's a consumption tax, and that's a bit of a problem because it's regressive. That is, people on the lower end of the pay scale tend to pay a higher proportion of their income than people on the upper end. So that's something to be looked at and corrected. Now, we already have carbon taxes in the form of fuel taxes, the gas taxes, and this is used to fund the highway fund. And it's something we already do, and a carbon tax could replace the fuel taxes and pretty much fund the same kinds of infrastructure that we do in building roads and so on. A carbon tax is an alternative to regulation, which is economically less efficient than just taxing things. And a carbon tax has to do with curbing demand by increasing the price, and we already know that the demand for carbon fuels, especially transportation fuels, is fairly elastic. And if you just look back to the OPEC oil embargo back in the late 80s, then you see that we actually did reduce car travel a lot when the price went way up during that embargo. It's a predictable, a tax is a very predictable thing, and it leads to fairly stable pricing, as you'll see in a few minutes. And it's supported by many oil industry leaders. If you look at the Climate Leadership Council and the founding members of it, it's pretty name brand thing, and it includes a lot of energy companies like BP and Conoco and Shell and Exxon and so on. So this is not an unpopular thing that even oil companies want a predictable price on carbon. And it has great bipartisan support, as you'll see in a minute. So there's some issues to resolve. And as I already mentioned, the welfare issue is the main one. It's a regressive tax. And so you need to find some way to formulate the tax so that we give back the money through dividends or something like that. Otherwise, we're going to have a rebellion. And as you saw in France, when the price of fuel went up, there was the Yellow Vest rebellion. And of course, during the OPEC oil embargo, when there was a national speed limit, we had the double nickel rebellion and so on. So we don't want anything to be too unpopular, but also recognize that fuel prices have been so variable in the last 15 years that it's hard to, make an effect that the effect of a tax is actually going to be less than some of the natural fluctuations that we have in the price. Another issue to resolve is leakage. We engage in international trade, and if we buy products from countries that do not have a carbon tax, we'll need to investigate using border adjustments to make it fair. There's also regional effects that we may need to adjust for because some states have large coal and oil economies, and they'll be disproportionately affected. And then there's always the question of what to do with the revenue from a carbon tax. And this is something that's likely to be in the scale of $100 billion and up. And so there's many ideas floating around, writing checks to citizens. We used to think writing checks to citizens was kind of crazy, but we're doing it now for the pandemic. We can do it for carbon tax just as well. We can use it to pay for infrastructure, grants to states, to let them take care of the welfare effects, deficit reduction, reduce other taxes, fund other initiatives. Lots of ideas for how to use the revenue. In terms of the welfare effects and the effects on GDP, there's a lot of good research, and this is one that just came out a few months ago. Diamond and Zodro with using the ZZ model to test welfare and GDP effects of a carbon tax. And it's now a well-studied thing, and when legislation is composed, then we know how to calculate those effects. If you look at the Resources for the Future webpage, they track a lot of the bills that are currently being proposed, And there are a number of them, and they have large variation in price from 15 to 50, over $50 per ton, and each with different numbers of supporters and co-sponsors and so on. And all of them are carbon fee or carbon tax, except one of them, which is still a cap and trade bill. So I think we're headed in the right direction. None of these things have a chance of passing anytime soon because, of course, we have a Senate majority leader from a coal state and a president that made us pull out of the Paris Accord and so on. So politics will have to change some, but there's a lot of stuff on deck for when it does. Next, price versus quantity policy. And when I got really interested, it was a question of, is carbon tax really better than cap and trade? People like the idea of cap and trade because it puts a real cap, a real barrier on how much carbon we can emit. So there's some certainty involved in it. And it also has a market aspect to it. And cap and trade was successful in the sulfur dioxide, at least for the first 10 years. Maybe less successful a little bit after that in the late 80s. So we need to think how these things work. And that's when I started using JMP and created an animations script to really understand how carbon taxes work. And so this is the script I'm going to show. And it's not too long a script. And it basically shows a graph. There's a graph box in there. And then it draws a bunch of supply and demand curves that characterize how a carbon tax works. And it shows little circles where these lines cross. And so let's take a look at what the result is. So we imagine, this is not real data or anything. This is just a conceptual map of how supply and demand curves work for demand for fossil carbon. And first, let's look at a demand curve. And by the way, these things have the X and Y axis reversed because that's the way economists do it in supply and demand curves. So we have to think of quantity as a function of price rather than the other way around, even though the X and Y axes are reversed in that sense. So demand curve looks like this with a negative slope. So when the price is high, we demand less of it. When the price is low, we demand more of it. And that's a characteristic of demand curves. And they aren't straight lines, but conceptually we'll think of them like a straight line in order to do the analysis. So that's the supply or the demand curve. What about the supply curve? Well, it's the opposite in slope. It has a positive slope. And so as the price gets higher, more quantity will be, will be supplied. And that's because the price will drive up more oil exploration, more fracking, more everything, and more will be delivered to the market. And when the price goes down, it's less economic to do some of the sources of transportation fuels and coal and so on. And so the supply curve has this positive slope. And of course, where they meet is where the market balances and where the actual price and the actual quantity is delivered to the market. So now, how does a carbon tax work? Well, a carbon tax works on the supply side. It basically shifts up the supply curve by the amount of the tax. So if you vertically shift up the supply curve, you get this orange line here. And that's not what the supplier sees. The supplier still sees that blue line, but the market sees the shifted supply because the tax has to be paid on a per carbon or per gallon or per ton of coal basis. And so all it's doing is shifting the market equilibrium from point A to point B, and that's going to result in a higher price for carbon fuels, carbon-based fuels, and a lower quantity, and it's going to allow us to limit the amount of carbon emissions because we're solving it as at a higher price due to the tax. So that's the carbon tax. It's very simple. What about a cap and trade system? Well, a cap is a limit on quantities. So here let's limit it at 40 units, let's say, which happens to solve the same price as a carbon tax would. But the supply curve it's addressing all of a sudden goes vertical at one point. And so below the cap, the supply curve is this blue line here. And then when it reaches the cap, it all of a sudden goes infinitely inelastic. It's a vertical cap. And so so it's this nonlinear function, this angle function here of a real supply curve then that hits the cap and then goes up so that no price can give you more supply. So it can solve the same problem as a carbon tax, but in a very different way, and very different behaviors, as you'll see in just a minute. And those different behaviors are that we really have a demand curve that really changes a lot. We have a supply curve that changes a lot too, and did very recently. So let's look at if there's a recession in the economy. And of course, we know that recessions happen. We certainly got one in 2008 and 2009. And all of a sudden, in a recession, and of course, that's true for the pandemic too, not just because of recession, because people stop traveling. All of a sudden, demand shifts so that we want less quantity for a given price. And so this is this recession demand curve here, this red line. And all of a sudden, the price equilibrium point then shifts to another point. And if we have a carbon tax, it shifts to D2, it shifts down by a little bit. And if we have a cap and trade instead, it shifts by a lot more. So going from B to C2 instead of B to D, it doesn't change. It just changes the price, not the quantity demand, assuming we're at the equilibrium price for the cap. So that's the basic lesson, that things change more in price. The price is a lot more unstable with a cap than it is with a tax. And if you look at boom demand, where the demand curve goes up, so if you go from recession to boom demand, it changes by a large amount. If you had a carbon tax that had the equivalent effect, it would, for a balanced or a regular economy, it would fluctuate a lot less. And so I put in a little animation button here. So if you see here, the green line going up and down is the effect of the price on using a cap, and the orange line is using tax. And so basically, there's a lot more price fluctuation with a cap because of the total inelasticity of the supply curve when you have a cap on it. And so this was, I think, a fairly persuasive thing, and using a jump script, a JSL script, to actually show all that behavior, I think was fairly illuminating. So let me have a few other comments. Pricing stability really makes a difference. Sulfur emissions trading worked for a while, but then it stopped working and the price really fell out of the bottom of the sulfur emissions trading back about 15 years ago. Also, we know that pricing works in funny ways. Remember when the Enron kind of cornered the market in electricity in California, and the prices went way up. So pricing instability is not great. And of course, the big recent oil war between Russia and Saudi Arabia really affected the supply curve. All of a sudden, Saudi oil turned on the spigots and flooded the world with oil at the very time when the pandemic was reducing demand. And we had a recent price extreme that just made headlines this week. We now have a futures price of oil that's negative I think $37.63. And oil has never had a negative price like this before, but the price instability due to these moves of the supply and demand curves has really been historic. So we like stable prices, and with stable prices for planning our use of fossil fuels, it means our long-term plans, the way we build our buildings, the cars we choose to buy, the trucks we choose to buy, and the way we choose to generate electricity depends on a stable price, because these are long-term investments. So a few closing thoughts. The tax doesn't have to be on everything that has carbon emissions. It needs, the primary cause is fossil fuels for transportation, heating, and electricity. There are many other ways that carbon enters the atmosphere, but let's not confuse a carbon tax with those things. And there's plenty of proposals, and I noticed the Curbelo bill and support must be bipartisan, because we can't pass legislation without bipartisan support. And proposals should only address a few consequential issues. Let's avoid having a long bill that puts in lots of special provisions and so on. We just need to correct a few things that everybody recognizes we need to correct. And we can't advertise it as inexpensive. It is going to have effect. The effect is not going to be too great on welfare or on GDP if we formulate it in the right way. And we should not call it a carbon tax. We should call it carbon tax reform, because tax reform is a friendly, positive word. In this generation, there's been trained to hate taxes. So that's my perspective, and using a little jump graphics, and take it away, Julian.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, John. And I'll try to get that script for you and get it posted in our community page for all of our viewers, because I think other people would probably want to play with that as well. So thank you so much. Our next speakers are Zoe and Sky from WildTrack, who are going to take us through their footprint identification technique using JMP and other pieces of software.
Excellent. And now share screen. Yeah, to share screen. Where's it gone?
Okay.
Oh, maybe wrong. Oh, there you go. That's it. No.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Brilliant. Are we on, Julian?
Yes, you are. We can see your screen and see you both. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Julian. And thanks, John, for a really interesting talk. We're very glad everybody's here. Today is Earth Day, 50 years since the very first Earth Day in 1970, so it's a special Earth Day. And this is a joint presentation between me and Sky, as usual. Before we start talking about WildTrack and how you can help with our conservation work, it'd be nice to just put this Earth Day into a little bit of context. I was really interested to read this morning that Earth Day is probably the largest non-sectarian observation in the world now. There are 1 billion people tuning into Earth Day and paying attention. The population is 7.8 billion, so that's a very large proportion of people on Earth are actually now interested in what happens with the Earth. They're aware of the problems that we face, destruction of natural habitat, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity being the biggest three. Biodiversity is where our personal work lies, but all these things are connected, as James Lovelock in the 1970s started formulating with his Gaia hypothesis. We can't take any one of those parts and cure it and ignore the rest. But the fact that so many people are paying attention now to the problems that we face as a global community is important. And I think until the last couple of months, many people, particularly those in the developed world, have almost been able to divorce themselves from these problems. But now with COVID-19 as a kind of global pandemic crisis, I think the whole issue of conservation has been brought into really sharp focus. COVID emerged in China, there's still some controversy about exactly where or how, but it could have emerged at any number of other countries where humans and wildlife are coming into conflict. It emerged as a result of animal trade by humanity in one form or another. And we have, I mean, even in New York City, there are more than 70 wet markets that supply live animals for food or parts. And that's right in the middle of the States. So it's going on everywhere. And this is the sort of the focus really now is on changing that, bringing better living standards, not only for animals, but for people as well. We're all connected. So that's kind of the, I guess, the wake-up call. And I'll be talking a little bit more about how we can deal with that in the next few slides. Oh, I don't think we're moving on there. How do we move our next slide? There we go. So one thing that came up recently in the press, which we were kind of excited about, was that WildTrack was actually selected as one of 50 social impact innovations that might save the world. And we felt, wow, that's great to be on this list, but social impact, that's a new list for us. We've never been on that. And I think that actually kind of showed us just how much people now realize that wildlife conservation is part of what is going to be important for the future of humanity as well. So that was really, really nice. So WildTrack is a relatively small non-profit, but we have a very wide range. We have projects all over the world, as you can see on this map. Different species, different countries, different continents. Every single project that we work with has a unique challenge. Some of them are focusing on human-wildlife conflict. For example, there's a project in Nepal where we have Indian tigers that are in conflict with the local villages. Some are focusing on habitat destruction. For example, giant panda in China, where pandas are confined now to much, much smaller areas of their habitat. Habitat fragmentation is a big problem in conservation. There are other problems where animals are just being poached for their parts, taken out, like rhinos and elephants in Africa. Every different project has a different challenge. The ecology is different. The community resources are different. And communities for us are very important, because if we as scientists go into an area and say, hey, you know, we've got a great fix, we're going to give you the technology, and we leave, quite often those projects don't get sustained. So building local communities into the projects is super important. And what can we do with the data that we collect? We're very data driven. The data that we collect is primarily footprints. And this is one of the things that makes WildTrack unique, I guess. We're not doing the normal knock animals out, put collars on, you know, handle them, keep observing them. We try to be as hands-off as possible, to disturb the animals in their natural habitat as little as possible. And not only does that impact on the good for the animals and for us, but it actually gives us more reliable data. Because if we change an animal's behavior in the process of monitoring it, the data that we get back, the data that we'll be feeding into JMP, are not reliable. So we try to be as hands-off as possible. We kind of think of our monitoring as conservation from the ground up. And it's literally from the ground up, because we're looking at footprints, as you can see on this slide. And each footprint is like a little microcosm of data. It's got so much data in it. If you were to look at a footprint on a rainy day and examine all the microbiological life inside, that would be another whole massive range of data, but we haven't got into that yet. We're just doing morphometrics, and now we're beginning to look at AI for identifying footprints as well. But footprints basically can give us baseline data that is essential for conservation. So that's basically how many animals are there and where are they? Those are the two kind of key data points that every wildlife manager needs to know. And those data inform on specific applications like, for example, conservation strategies in particular places, trade in endangered species, human-wildlife conflict, a range of specific problems that we deal with, and increasingly now even things like the emergence of new zoonotic viruses like coronavirus. We can track these viruses using animal trade routes, animal trade patterns, and we can track those using footprints. So our work, I think, has come into much more focus in its new direct link with humanity. And footprints, we think, are the key to the future. I guess I should also say they're much more ubiquitous than the animals themselves. So you might be out all day and never see a rhino, but you'll see the footprints and you can collect those data. So footprints are cool things.
This is where I come in, and as usual, I've been given about 30 seconds to explain how FIT works in JMP. It's been a really, really interesting journey, developing the footprint identification technique. We do the feature extraction, we do all the analytics, we do the mapping, and it's really a one-stop tool designed to answer those very, very fundamental questions that Zoe explained a few minutes ago. Before I dive into a live demo of JMP and the way in which you use FIT, I just want to point out two things about footprints. One is that they are very, very characteristic of the species. Once you get into footprints in a big way, you begin to understand that there are very, very marked differences which allow you to identify species very, very easily most of the time, unless you're talking about black and white rhino, in which case it's a little bit more complex. But the other thing to mention, and Zoe mentioned as well, is that footprints are very, very ubiquitous. So whereas you might not see the animal, for example, with the Amur tiger that we work with in Northeast China in the snowfields, it's very, very rare to see an Amur tiger, but you will see their footprints very, very clearly. Okay, this gives a brief summary of the way in which FIT works in JMP. Essentially what we do is we take digital images of footprints, very, very simple digital images. We try to keep the system as simple as possible. Simple digital images. These images are then imported, I lost my mouse, imported into JMP. We do feature extraction in JMP. Then we basically extract a large number of metrics. We over 100 metrics in the way of distances, angles, areas. We then take multiple images from each trail. The data is taken into JMP, and we do the analytics in JMP, which allows us to identify the animals at the individual level. We can identify sex, we can identify species and subspecies if we need to, and so in some cases, we can even actually identify age classes. So I'm not going to escape this in the hope that I can get back to it when I can. And get on to JMP. Let's put JMP off as well. I need JMP 15. Okay, we're back in business over here. So that's the JMP main menu. And what we've essentially done is put FIT in the main menu. And these are the species, and I hope you can see them. These are the species for which we've already developed algorithms. So anything from African lion to Amur tiger, to giant pandas, leopards, even lowland tapir, and we've even got box turtle somewhere in there, which is not footprints, but that's another story in itself.
Shell prints.
Shell prints, there we go. Okay. So the way in which FIT works is that if I go to FIT and I open up the window for Amur tiger, it brings up this particular window, and all the features that we are actually trying to analyze in this little box over here. So we do image feature extraction, we do pairwise data analysis, we can do validated discriminant analysis to basically consolidate our models, and we've also introduced mapping. And as I said, it's a one-stop tool which allows us to identify individuals, find out the sex, age class, and so on, and map exactly where that footprint came from. So if I launch this application now, it brings up this window. It's all customized for each species. This is for the Amur tiger. The left side of the window is inert. The right side is the active window. And I'm just going to run through this very, very quickly. We pull in an image, we resize it. We've got a protocol which we've established for doing the feature extraction. We rotate the image so it's standardized. We then scale it, and we can change the scale factor, which is over here. We put in the scale factor, and then we put in these, what we call landmark points, which is the manual input at the moment. We're trying to come up with an automated system. It's extremely difficult to basically get machine learning to do what I am doing, but we are making huge progress with a team from Berkeley. And having done that, I hit the derived points and a pen row, and basically it's all script driven, and it generates all the XY coordinates and a whole bunch of variables. And I said these are distances, angles, and areas. We then feed that data into a data table, which is over here for the Amur tiger. As you can see over here, we've got a large data set. For the Amur tiger, the data set was developed from captive animals in China. And I can now navigate through here to do the pairwise analysis. And I'm going to go through this very, very rapidly. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to deal with them. We've created a customized model to deal with this type of data. And I'm just going to show you what the output looks like when we do the analysis. So here we are, we've got these number of trails. We know where these trails come from which animals they come from. But essentially what the analysis is now going to do is to ignore the IDs of these trails, and it's basically going to place these trails into categories and give me a prediction of the number of tigers which are represented by those trails. So if I run that, we need to animate that tiger running, I think. And if I hit this button over here, this is the final output. And basically it's telling me that there are 4 tigers predicted. And yes, 1, 2, 3, 4. But more importantly, are the trails, because we get multiple trails, we collect multiple trails from these tigers and other species, of course, are the trails classified correctly? And once again, this is a very, very snapshot example of how the analytics works. So basically what we've done is we've taken trails from the wild, which our Chinese colleagues collected. So these trails are sitting at the bottom over here, which our Chinese colleagues collected from China, from the Amur tiger region. If I go back into that, I switch that off. Amur tiger. And if I just slot in those trails, which come from a wild population, this is only a selection of trails. This is just to give you a demonstration, and it's going to run the analysis. We don't know the IDs of these animals, but we do know where the trails belong to each other because they were collected from the same path, if you like. And if I hit that again, what it is saying is of the trails that we collected, there are 7 tigers predicted. We also have a confidence interval system which enables us to tell us, well, how effective is that particular prediction. So that really gives you a very, very quick idea of the way in which the analytics works. Now, there's a lot more to show, but I won't sort of go into more detail about this. I'll go back into the slideshow.
Now you need to change display settings again.
Do I?
Yeah, because I think, yeah, just do this. There we go.
Okay, brilliant. Okay. Okay, and it's essentially, this just gives you a brief idea of the type of output that we get with our analytics. We've actually been able to tell Amur tiger from Bengal tiger. Not that that's that useful, but it's an interesting fact. Yeah, we can do sex discrimination very effectively over here, as you can see. This is the analytics over here, feature extraction. We do holdback trials, make sure that our models are working effectively, and so on. So I'm going to leave at this point, and Zoe is going to take over again.
Okay, so I guess the last part of the interface in the analytics in JMP for us is the mapping. And although it's the last part, some would argue it's the most important part. All the GIS people that we work with say mapping is not the icing on the cake, it is the cake. So mapping for us is the thing that we present to wildlife managers who say, okay, I don't want to see all these data tables, I just want to know where are my animals. So mapping is very important in that respect, the final output. And there are 3 mapping platforms in JMP that we use very regularly. One is kind of like the first go-to point, which is in Graph Builder, which is how to use the mouse on this computer. I don't know, where's the mouse?
Okay, because it comes
point to this one. The first one is Graph Builder, where you can basically take in your data and quickly have a look, quickly decide what's going to be interesting for further investigation. And Graph Builder's now got some very nice new mapping features, as you can see in this image here. When we want to know a little bit more about quantifying range sizes, we go to an add-in which was developed by Dan Shikori, which is called Home Range, which actually allows us to get the size of ranges and how animals are interacting with each other within those ranges. And I should say in both of them you can put in background maps, which is very cool. And then if we want to know how animals are actually interacting with each other in time, in real time, we can do bubble plots in JMP. And I can't show you this in an animated form today, but it's easy to give a demo if you're interested. I think there's even one up on the JMP site. So those are 3 very cool approaches. And we always say to our colleagues in GIS, well, JMP may not have as many kind of capabilities as GIS, but it has got the power of the analytics behind it, which gives us much more opportunity to really drill into the data. So that's, I think. So having gone through the kind of basics of what we do and why we're doing it, I guess a key question that we're often asked is, how can I help? People in all sorts of walks of life are interested in conservation, increasingly so. How can they help us with our work? What can they do? Well, here's an image showing people literally taking footprints, which is one way that you can help. And there are we have projects all over the world, and lots of people who are not associated with the projects as citizen scientists, who are helping us collect data through our Conservation FIT program. Conservation FIT is our citizen science wing, I guess, and we have a separate part of our website, Conservation FIT, which gives a lot of explanation about how you can help, how you can be involved. And we've also now got some new training materials, some new infographics, and some new interactive videos that people can go through, wander through at their own speed. They're kind of like self-directed to show exactly how to pick up footprints. And we've got 2 different guides, one for captive animals in zoos, where we develop a lot of our FIT algorithms, and then there's another one for free-ranging animals for people who are out in the field. So please go to our site, take a look at these. They're super cool. They were designed for us by Learn It Digitally. Done a wonderful job, and we have some homemade music to introduce them. And we're going to have them translated into English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin. So we're hoping that they will have a good audience and that they'll be useful in helping people participate. So more specifically, where's my phone gone? I can't find it. But if you carry a smartphone and it's got a camera, you can also pick up footprints for us using a couple of different apps. First of all, there's an app by an organization called iNaturalist, which we're still using for kind of occasional species level observations. And this is a very cool app because you can get out there, you get onto iNaturalist, open up the app, and you take a picture of something. And if you're not sure what it is, iNaturalist will give you suggestions, as you can see here on the left. It'll actually say, okay, you've seen this. This is something I picked up in the woods the other day, and I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And straight away it gives me an identification for it. And you can even try that with footprints. But we're collecting species level footprint observations. In other words, an odd footprint that you find here or there. iNaturalist is a great place for you to be able to do that. And you just have to upload it to our WildTrack Footprints project within iNaturalist. The second way that you can help collect footprints is through an app called Epi Collect, which is rather more for the sort of scientific collection, people who are helping us collect footprints for algorithms or for field implementation. This is also another excellent app. It's very easy to pick up images. There's a training manual on our website now, and we're just starting to get that off the ground. So what happens if you don't like going outside? We know some people who don't like going outside, and you never see footprints. How can you help? Well, there's still plenty of ways that you could help with WildTrack's mission. There are lots and lots of ways you can help with all sorts of environmental missions. But if you have a skill, a particular skill set, and you think we could use it, we'd love to hear from you. It might be game design, it might be database design. We get a lot of help from all the wonderful developers and marketing people at JMP. It might be something completely outside that domain. Maybe you're good at fundraising or you're good at communicating educational materials. Please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. We can all participate in Earth Day and Saving the Earth, and hopefully all through the year, not just on this special day. And I think with that, we would like to thank everybody who's helped us, really. So many people. We get a huge amount of help from JMP, and JMP, as you know, is part of SAS. From John Sall, the JMP developers who are always there to help us and who are fantastic. We work with the Army Research Office, with SenseFly for our drone development. We've just started getting some great data and project work with the UC Berkeley School of Information. We have students and colleagues around the world, and I guess we must thank the Indigenous Trackers of Africa who started this whole process with us, and the rhinos for leading the charge. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And
we did have time for questions, but I don't know if we do any more. Julian, what do you think?
Please take away.
Probably not time, but I will invite everybody to interact with you on our segment pages. And yeah, I just thank you so much for presenting to us, both of you. That was really, really great. Thank you.
Thanks for being there.
Thanks.
Take care. So our next presenter will actually have Jerry back, who is our manager of sustainability, environmental sustainability manager here at SAS. And Jerry's going to share with us some of our award-winning environmental initiatives. So welcome back again, Jerry.
Mess with the technology too much here. I'll just go with this. But hey, thanks everybody for allowing me to join JMP On Air today and help celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which obviously will be celebrated a little more digitally this year. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy and able to be productive from home. So for my 10-minute slot today, I'm going to share a little information about what SAS is doing to be an environmentally responsible company. Talk about some of our initiatives and why it's becoming increasingly important for us to be active in this space. Advance here. All right, so this is an image I grabbed from the SAS.com homepage. The 2020 theme for Earth Day is climate action, which is a concern that's justifiably gaining consensus as existential in importance. For Earth Day, it's since it was officially recognized in 1970, it's grown to the point where it's observed in 192 countries and considered the largest secular holiday in the world and celebrated by more than 1 billion people each year. I think, how cool is that, you know? All right, the big question is why we should, as a company, care. So increased access to data and the power of analytics is making it increasingly clear that human actions are adversely impacting the health of our planet. The data showing that global CO2 levels are rising. They're up 15% since the climate conference in Rio in 1992. Global average temperatures have increased a degree Fahrenheit over the past 25 years. And in that time, global sea levels have risen about 3.1 inches. Storms increasing with frequency and impact, while other areas such as California are experiencing record droughts. And the impact on biodiversity from climate change is sobering. Since 1970, scientists have discovered that bird populations have declined almost 30%. And a 2018 study estimated that about 40% of insect species are in decline. So, and as you might expect, there's even environmental tie-in to our current COVID-19 crisis. As humans encroach on new habitats and we come in more frequent contact with wildlife, especially via the trade of wild animals and wet markets. It's estimated that 3/4 of infectious diseases originate in wild animals, and it's highly suspected that the COVID-19 virus originated in bats or penguins. So a picture of the pangolin is pictured in the top right of the slide, and it's probably the most trafficked animal in the world. So just, with all things considered, what we've observed and what we found with data, I think the time to care is now. All right, the business reasons for caring are pretty straightforward. For years, we've seen rapidly increasing amounts of environmental and social responsibility questionnaires from our customers. Doing business with good corporate citizens is essentially a risk mitigator for our customers and a competitive differentiator for our suppliers. We find that people want to work for companies that stand for something more than just making money. And we think our environmental actions are helping to both recruit and retain top talent. Operating more efficiently is saving SAS money. At SAS headquarters, efficiency gains from our office buildings alone show that we're about 40% more efficient than just 9 years ago. So all things equal, with no improvement, our electricity spend alone would have been about $2 million higher in 2019 without the efficiency gains. And obviously, there's potential, lots of revenue potential, a rapidly growing number of opportunities to apply analytics toward mitigating the impacts from climate change. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, environmental stewardship is important, as a key driver for business. And, and the rationale is ultimately businesses thrive in healthy economies, or healthy environments and healthy economies, and healthy communities found to buy more goods and services. So we do have a vested interest here. All right, I thought I should throw this in. Before I jump to the environmental program, I think it's more important ever that online presentations even include some level of social distancing. I think Anya McGirt will address this more thoroughly in her IoT of Bees presentation shortly. So thank you for your support, and I know we're going to get through this. All right, now with the environmental program. My team's roles include a variety of activities, from ensuring employee engagement to standard legislative compliance, responding to customer questionnaires and surveys, collecting and reporting our environmental data and performance, and providing domain expertise across our operations. In short, it's our job is to help ensure that SAS is incorporating environmental responsibility into our day-to-day operations. So I get this question a lot. That's, when did the environmental program start? So I think we can pretty much track it back to officially starting in 2007. We initiated a baseline exercise to see, what we were doing. So we always knew we were a great place to work, but how environmentally responsible were we? Turns out we had a pretty good track record from the very beginning, including John Sall recycling data punch cards from the very earliest years of the company. All right, this is something I'm particularly proud of. Last year, we announced publicly stated environmental goals. These included 25% absolute reduction in emissions by 2025 compared to our 2011 baseline year. We also have goals to increase our office building efficiencies by 40%. For energy intensity and 50% for carbon intensity. Other goals include commitments to supporting plug-in electric vehicle technology and applying LEED best practices. LEED is the U.S. Green Building Council's leadership in energy and environmental design standard. We're also committed to supporting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. As the chart on this slide shows, we've made considerable progress. And all this is despite adding 25% more employees and 35% more office and data center square footage since 2011. All right, as the infographics here on the left show and the chart at the bottom details, we're also making great progress on our efficiency intensity goals. So, overall, we're 20% on our journey for the absolute, but we're up to 34% energy use intensity for our buildings and 54% with our carbon use intensities. And that number is going to improve significantly for our 2019 reporting year. And as I suspect with our shutdown or temporary hiatus in operations, I think our carbon footprint is going to look particularly good next year. All right, ultimately, how are we going to meet these goals? And essentially, it's just ongoing SAS commitments to invest in the highest efficiency and smart technologies, renewable energy, electric vehicle infrastructure, and incorporating environmentally friendly practices across our operations. All right, the environmental program collects data from our offices around the world. We're tracking and reporting our environmental performance externally on our CSR report. Of course, we're using our own software to help grow our understanding of our business, improve our efficiencies, and reduce our carbon footprint. You can see the VA reports that we're using on our CSR report. If you just go to sas.com/CSR, you can access them there. One of the drivers for increasing our public transparency with environmental reporting is the growing number of customers asking for information so they can minimize risk in their supply chain and verifying that they're doing business with good corporate partners. In our two primary environmental CSR-related questionnaires, we have more than 60 requesting customers that are asking us to report performance. These services review our data and give SAS a performance rating, and I'm proud to say that we typically score around the 90th percentile against other companies. All right, many of you probably know that we have solar farms. We've had a pretty good success record with our solar farm investments that first started generating power back in 2008 with a large PV system and a couple of rooftop thermal hot water systems. We now have 9 PV and thermal systems that generate about 2.5 megawatts of power and generate about in capacity and generate about 4 million kilowatt hours annually. But since it was activated in 2008, when SAS broke the 1 megawatt barrier for the whole southeastern U.S., the capacity of solar installations in North Carolina has grown to about 6,200 megawatts, which has been annually ranking second nationally. SAS essentially proved that solar was viable in North Carolina, and the community responded. I really think the success of our first solar farm helped legitimize the environmental program, and it also got employees fired up about sustainability, and essentially was the impetus for a lot of our other initiatives. All right, many of you know that we have sheep. Most of you often recognize them as goats. I think we should get back in touch with nature so employees can readily recognize the difference between sheep and goats. Goats, we found wiring and infrastructure that would be on the solar panels. So we found that sheep were a much more sustainable option. So essentially, we have sheep that maintain the height of the grass and helping with general maintenance out there. But we found that if we really wanted to do all this just for PR purposes, that we could have built a much smaller solar farm and then focused on the sheep, because everybody loves the sheep. thought it would be pretty cool to include a couple of cell phone pictures I took when we had our big snowstorm earlier this year. It was really interesting to watch the snow melt off the panels as the sun traveled from east to west. You know, what made it even more interesting was the data that we captured throughout the day. It was neat to watch the subsystem combiner box data light up as the snow melted. And you can kind of make out of this in a little bit in the heat map located in the top right. But JMP's very own Xan Gregg will be sharing more of the solar visualizations, data visualizations a little later in the program. And I don't know if many people know this, but for the past 10 years, the revenue and cost savings from our solar investments have generated about $1 million in revenue and savings annually. And I think this is just one of the many examples as to why investments in sustainability make good business sense. All right,
Jerry, we're just around at the end of your time. If sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we're just a little bit over on that. So I'm wondering if you could.
Okay, so I have how many minutes do I have left?
-3.
Oh, negative. Well, have I been 10 minutes already?
It's easy when it's interesting stuff to talk through, though, unfortunately.
Okay, well,
yeah, thank you, though. I'm sorry.
This. Actually, my little timer here had me at like 6 minutes, so I thought I was doing pretty good on that.
I'm sorry about that, Jerry.
So, okay, so I'll try to wrap it up with quick as possible. You know, we are investing in LEED design guidelines for new construction. Approximately all offices since 2005 have achieved LEED certification, and we have approximately 82% of our buildings on campus are LEED certified. All right, Building C was our first LEED certified building at or second LEED certified building at campus headquarters, but it was our first to achieve LEED Platinum, which was the first in Wake County and just among a handful of the ones that were in North Carolina. It has tons of environmental features, and at this time I'd like to just give a quick shout out to Canada, who had our first LEED certified building, but they've recently recertified under existing building category and achieved platinum certification as well, so big kudos to them. All right, Building A, our newest building on campus, is chock full of environmentally friendly features, including access to tons of data and sensors that we're using in our building clarity solution, co-developed by Sas, and we're really gaining a lot of insights into the overall performance of the building. Another big feature with this building is the fact that we changed the point of interconnection for Solar Farm 1 and connected it to the building, and it's now, it's providing about 50% of our overall energy for the building. All right, this is a great picture of it. You can see the proximity to the solar farm. All right, I mentioned our EV support. So since we started adding charging stations in 2011, we've gone from just having a couple vehicles to, actually this slide was updated but didn't reflect, but I think we have 65 plug-in charging ports and probably close to 300 plug-in electric vehicles across campus right now. All right, many of you know we have bees. Anya's going to talk more about our work with our IoT of bees data here shortly, but we installed hives back in 2011. We have 4 hives currently. There are about 50 hives that are located at our offices around the world, and so this has been a big deal for Sas. We have employee tours. We're collecting honey, jumping through here. We collected 70 pounds the year before last, and then this last year we have 130 pounds, and this will be made available to employees in our cafeterias. One other thing that we've done in the past that even Sky and Zoe have helped out with is actually we've been studying or collecting data, about 3 years of data of bird collisions with our office buildings. So it's helping us to at least figure out how to do mitigation to limit this, kind of going forward. There's a lot of new technologies that are surfacing that are, helping to mitigate this problem. So one of the side effects from this is that, we're often asked to come in and talk to customers about birds and bees, which makes for interesting presentations. And finally here, it's last slide, it just kind of talks about our general advocacy. So, and I love this quote right here. It's essentially that we believe that connecting analytics and advocacy to create something new, better, purposeful, and lasting. I love it because it's so true. Can you imagine, what could be accomplished for the environment with access to good data and analytics and the ability to take some of the political posturing, to kind of eliminate the emotions associated with that. So, SAS has been very passionate about this and advocates for the benefits of a clean energy economy. Because of this advocacy, and you can see in the top right left here that Governor Cooper signed the executive order for the clean energy economy for North Carolina right at the Sas solar farm. So a number of other things I could jump in, but and I know this was a lot to digest in 10 minutes, but there's so much more to share. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and to learn more about the environmental program. And thanks again for allowing me to help celebrate Earth Day with John.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And yeah, I love everything you shared. I mean, it makes me really proud to be at a company that supports these initiatives. And actually, one that you just mentioned, we have Anya McGurk, who's going to take us through monitoring the Sas Beehives.
Hello. Greetings, everybody. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
I am almost there. So today, well, happy Earth Day. And I know we're running well behind, and I have a lot of slides and so many exciting things to show you that I'm just going to jump right into it. So at SAS, we have 4 beehives, as Jerry talked about. They are managed by Bee Downtown. And I'm in the IoT division at SAS, and we deal with sensor data. And I'm also a beekeeper. So somehow I convinced somebody that we had to put sensors on our beehives so that we could better understand what was happening. And today I'm going to show you the results of some of that work. The hives are out by the solar farm that Jerry was just showing you pictures of. And that's pretty cool for us because the solar farm gives us all kinds of weather data every 15 minutes. So the hope is that we're going to be able to tie the data that we get from our beehives and join it with the weather data to understand more about what bees are up to. This is part of our IoT team here. What you see is a fake hive box where we have some equipment. We have a gateway in there, and our ultimate goal is to stream all different kinds of data from the beehive, and we'll get into that a little bit. And we're going to do it. We're going to send the data up to our network via cellular connection. We're partially there, but initially we basically had to put the sensors in and see what we could learn so that we could figure out how to analyze it, what was the best approach. So we started last April. We put scales under the hive, measuring the weight of the whole hive. Obviously, there'll be a lot of things that affect the weight. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We added in an internal temperature and humidity sensor. In this picture, you see Ben from Bee Downtown. Can you see my pointer? We have a temperature humidity sensor here. And we also put in a microphone later in August. So that's what this cord is. We slipped the microphone in there and have a cord running along the top of the frame so that we could do some audio recording and see what we could learn from what the bees were saying in the hive. But before we put the microphone in, I would just go out there and literally throw a microphone in the hive with my little hand recorder, bring it back and see what I heard, which was quite interesting. So we started out with a very kind of crude approach to see what we could learn. And it's been a ton of fun. We're also taking videos at the hive entrance, and the goal is to count how many bees are coming and going. And of course, we'd like to be doing this all in real time, and we're getting there. So today I'm just going to show you a little bit about the things that we've learned from these sensors. This was the first couple weeks on the scale what we learned. Here's 2 hives that we had. So this is showing the total weight of the hive. As you can see, it's during the nectar flow in North Carolina. Weights are going up, which is always a good thing. But right away, the first week, I was like, whoa, we can pick up a swarm. A swarm is when it's a colony's way of reproducing. The old queen leaves with half the workers. And usually they'll lose anywhere from 4 to 12 pounds, depending on how big the hive is. And you can see here, we had, within 15 minutes, we had a 4.8 pound drop. So we knew something was going on. And again, 2 weeks later, we had another drop in weight. So this hive had a secondary, what we call a secondary swarm. And that's quite interesting for us. Because basically what happens is when the old queen leaves, she leaves a bunch of queen cells. And then the first queen to emerge will start calling out to see if there's any other competition, see if there's any other queens in the hive. And if there's too much competition, then sometimes she'll take off with a bunch of the bees. And typically that'll happen when the hive is too crowded. And so because we weren't streaming this data, we didn't see it live. But if we had seen it live, we saw the first swarm, we could have called the beekeeper and said, hey, you better go out there. I think they're too crowded. Instead, we lost 2 swarms. And then finally, we contacted him. We read the data and we said, oops, we've had some swarms. And he went and he put on another box on top of the hive. So right away, we could see the value of what we were going to learn. In addition to just monitoring the honey flow and saying, yeah, it's happening, and then here it's slowing down. So we knew it was going to be a lot of fun and we were going to learn a lot from the data. The second day that I was very excited, we go out and there was a dead hive, right? I went out to pick up the data. And before I read the data, everybody was speculating on what must have happened. How did that hive die? And most people's, the most popular theory was that the bees probably just left. They absconded. That's a word that a lot of beekeepers use. My bees absconded. But really, they have no idea what happened. So I said, well, let's read the data. So we read the data, and it turns out that in August 5th, over an 8-hour period, the hive lost 25 pounds. And I was like, whoa, somebody, actually, it turns out when we read the other hives, data, it turns out that the green hive here decided that they were going to go and invade the red hive. So they invaded and they stole all the honey, all the food. And then of course the red hive is left without any nutrition. And this is in August when things are hot and there's no nectar flow. And so we call it the dearth. So the dearth is on. So basically the bees eat the stores that they collected during the spring. So you could see right away what the problem was. Hive number 4 came and stole all the food from the red hive, and the red hive was completely dead by the time we found it in August. And this happens actually, the red hive, it turns out we had tested for mites, and they had a lot of mites. And mites are basically this little parasitic, virulent insect that attaches to the bees and devastates them by introducing lots of viruses. And so we knew that the red hive was weak, and we figured, oh, it probably won't make it through the winter. But we didn't realize that our stronger hive was going to figure out that they were weak and then go in and steal everything. So that's what happened there. So again, we were just finding the value of this kind of information. Here you see that same robbery. But what was fun is, or what was interesting is we lost 25 pounds on this one hive, but we only saw a gain of close to 15 pounds with the purple hive. So we were wondering, geez, somebody else in the neighborhood must have been involved. There must be some bees somewhere nearby. Probably a week after this one hive died, I went out to do a recording one morning, and I get out there and a robbery is in progress. And I was so excited because I had my microphone with me so I could record the sounds in the hives during the robberies. But I was also able to see that there was some other bees coming from another neighborhood. And it turns out that it just happens to be John Sall's neighborhood. John has bees. So we were able to see that John was invading the Sas hives, his bees were. So that was quite fun. I could give him a hard time. John, are you on? Anyway. So John's bees were also getting involved. But back to the Sas hives, what was interesting, it's the same strong hive went and was invading the second hive that had the second highest mite count. So we could see the importance of staying on top of the mite problem, trying to reduce the number of mites that you have, because it made them very weak and subject to stealing. So because I was out there, I can show you what a robbery is like. Here's the victims, hive number 3. Hopefully you can hear the sound. So you can see there's a lot of chaos up front. And here are the robbers. I think the only, let me record. There's not that much difference. The only real difference I can tell is on the victims, you see a few more bees on the side, but there's basically a lot of chaos in all the hives. But what's devastating about these robberies, bees have every hive has guard bees out front, and they basically, every bee that's coming in, they usually smell them, and if they don't smell right, they'll chase them off, right? And so they don't let the robbers in very easily. So there was a huge battle going on inside the hive, and this is the result. The next day, outside the hive that was being robbed, you can see. So it's quite, not only do they lose all their food reserves, but there's a lot of deaths in the meantime. It's kind of a sad picture to see. Just to show you a couple other pictures of the kind of interesting patterns that we see that we're hopefully going to be analyzing in more detail. Here you see 4 nights. See these straight lines? That's nighttime. So 4 different nights. You can see how clear the pattern is, right? What happens is all the bees go into the hive by sunset. So you have a fixed number of bees in your hive for however long the night is. And they're maybe dehydrating some honey or eating a little bit of honey. So they're just losing kind of a stationary amount, consistent over time. And then first thing in the morning, the bees, the foragers go out looking for food. And so by having the scale underneath them, we can tell how many pounds of bees are leaving. 3,000 bees equals a pound. So in this case, I can see 3,000 bees went out looking for food. And then they come back, go out again in the afternoon, and then come back in at nighttime. And what I was struck by was how regular this pattern is, day after day. And so I'm speculating that the weather was very consistent for each of these days because the pattern is so similar. And I should say that this afternoon, big drop in weight, I would go out and observe, and you can see the new foragers coming out at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon during this time of year. And they would orient, they would try to figure out where their hive is. They come out, go circles, and then go back and land on their hive. So they're basically trying to make sure they know where home is so that they can go out and forage the next day. So it's quite interesting to watch these orientation flights, they're called. Similarly, during the dearth, so this is in August, actually September, you can see again, you have such similar patterns. And what's interesting in the fall, you can see the orientation flights. Here you can see this hive had some new foragers being oriented, and then the next day they didn't really have very many new foragers. So it seems like every other day in this case. So I can tell already that the number of new babies in the hive is being reduced, which is typical in the fall. So these are the kinds of patterns that we want to use SAS and JMP tools to analyze. Here's 2 examples of 2 hives that I have with very different weights. So I graphed them on 2 different scales. So hive 2, which is the blue hive, is a very lightweight hive, and hive 1 is the red hive. And what struck me in this graph is how similar the patterns are, even though the number of bees in the different hives are very different. So they're all gaining. This is again during the nectar flow. But what you see is you start to see some divergence. The bigger hive does a lot better, and then this was a cold snap where nobody was really bringing in nectar. And then there's similar patterns again. And I was trying to figure this out. And I have a hypothesis that in the beginning, the nectar flow was not that big. And so the smaller hive could keep up with the bigger hive. And then when things really started blooming, the extra bees in the red hive helped them separate themselves. So these are the kind of observations that we're sort of just looking at the data, figuring it out, and then we're going to figure out how we can use it to maybe alert beekeepers when one hive is not doing as well as it should have done, etc. So what do we learn with internal temperature? I was not sure at all what we were going to learn. It turns out that, oh, by the way, on the left-hand side, you see a big swarm of bees. So that's where the old queen left with half the workers. And this is actually a picture from Sas. One of the hives swarmed. So you can see that's a lot of bees. I don't know what that swarm weighed. I'm going to guess 10 pounds or so. It's a lot of bees. But anyway, it turns out that the internal temperature in the hive does all of a sudden spike before the swarm. And I've heard a lot of people talk about it, so I was curious, can we use the temperature increase as a prediction of a swarm or not? And I'll show you some data on that in a minute. Temperature is also important when the hive is making babies. They have to maintain the temperature between 92 and 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And so just by keeping track of temperature, we can tell whether there is some brood in the hive or not. And we'll look at how this thermoregulation, how we can learn about the strength of the hive by looking at how well they're thermoregulating. And it turns out that when robberies happen, the temperature and the humidity also go up. So we can use that sort of information to alert the beekeeper. These are pictures from one of my hives this year. This year I've had so many swarms in my apiary, it's amazing. But this shows you in the far left graph, I see temperature. So you can see the internal temperature they are maintaining. Obviously there's brood, right? They're maintaining right around 95 degrees. And then all of a sudden there's a big spike in temperature and then it drops back down again. And here's the weight of the hive. So they started out at 115, almost 116 pounds. And then there's a sudden drop. It's not a very big swarm in this case, a little over 2 pounds. But it turns out that I'd say the temperature drop happened, or the temperature increase happened at just about the same time. So I'm continuing to watch swarms and trying to figure out if there's an early warning, but I don't think it's going to give us much of a warning. Okay, so temperature and brood production. Remember I said if the bees are having babies, they have to maintain the temperature between 92 and 98, and that's this gray band. And oh, by the way, if you've never seen a frame with brood on it, here's a frame from our Sas bees. You can actually see the queen here if you look closely. She's got a green dot, we marked her. But this is all capped brood, so you know the frame has a lot of brood. So if they have a lot of brood, they have to maintain that temperature. So you can see this hive is maintaining the temperature between 92 and 98. The ambient temperature is in the 80s, fluctuating around. But you see that it's actually not that consistent. It's sort of reflecting the changes in the ambient temperature. So I would say that this hive is actually not that strong. They're not able to maintain it pretty steady at 95. And I actually knew, I went in and inspected this hive and I knew they were having trouble. I saw some evidence of some viruses and diseases. In fact, on August 28th, I actually removed the queen and replaced her with another queen. And I just wanted to show you what the effect is. So here you can see some of the brood. There's probably a less brood, right? I removed the queen. And what's interesting is a week later, I could see that the new queen was doing much better. The hive was much stronger. They were able to maintain it with a lot less variability than they did before. And then you keep on going all the way out. And then October, I start to see it drop down. And that's exactly what we expect. We expect that the bees stop reproducing as much as the fall is coming into winter. So it's wonderful that I don't have to go into my hive and take a look. I can actually just look at the temperatures and see and understand, yes, what's happening. And I can compare my hives easily. Let's see. Okay, now I want to tell you briefly what I was hearing when I'm throwing my microphone in. This, to me, was the most fun part because I had no idea what I was going to learn. I do know that a lot of beekeepers say that they can hear from the hive, the sound in the hive, whether or not bees have a queen, because they tend to get very irritated if they don't have a queen. Obviously, they need a queen. The queen is the reproduction unit, really, in the hive. She's the one that is doing all of the reproducing. So if they don't have a queen, they know they're in trouble. So anyway, we'll skip this since I don't have much time. I wanted to let you hear what it sounds like in a hive that's being robbed. So I should tell you here that what I'm doing is short-time Fourier transform. So I'm basically collecting sound, and I have time on this axis. And every like a third of a second, I analyze the sound segment and I try to figure out what are the dominant frequencies. So this is frequency along the y-axis. And so the brighter the color, it means the more dominant that frequency. So let me just play the sound. Here there's a lot of and the dominant frequencies in most hives are under 400. This is 400 hertz. So 400, seconds. But I just want to contrast with the following day on this same hive after the robbery, so you get an idea. Very sad, right? There's not many bees left. So there's a huge difference in mood of the hive following the robbery. Oops, sorry, I went too far. Okay, so in analyzing, when I throw a microphone in the hive, I realize that the microphone is picking up all kinds of noises. At the Sas hives in particular, we have airplanes flying overhead. And there's actually a train that we pick up. And so if I want to get a good picture of what the spectrogram looks like, I need to be able to get rid of all the extra sounds. And so I spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out how I was going to pull away the sounds I didn't want. And then I realized, wait a minute, we have this procedure, machine learning, robust principal components analysis, and it's typically used on videos. And the way it works is you have your original video and it actually separates the foreground from the background. So I thought, wait a minute, maybe I can use robust principal components analysis to separate the noises I don't want, like the trains and the planes, from the noises that I'm interested in. Because I was interested in what is the hum of the hive. So here I'm showing you an example of two spectrograms. So I had a noise sample, and then I used robust principal components analysis, and this was the matrix that pulled off all the odd noises. You can see the weird loud frequencies here, and I end up with just the hum of the hive, which is what I was interested in trying to capture. But in this case, the sound that I pulled out was not a train or a plane. Let's listen to it. But I think you heard the main sound that I wanted you to hear. In this case, the sound that we removed was actually something we're very interested in. It is the virgin queen following the swarm. The first virgin that emerges will toot, and that was a queen toot. So you can see there was 2 toots, and then a response by another queen that was in the hive. And so this will happen after a swarm, and what happens is the first one that emerges will hear the response, and then she'll go and either kill that queen or she'll leave the hive with some workers. So anyway, robust principal components analysis turned out to work beautifully on sound to separate out the hum of the hive from other noises. Most of the time, we're not interested in the sparse matrix, but in this particular case, we were interested in it. And actually, I did all this in Sas, so I basically took a WAV file, did STFT, and then I could separate it out and then go back and listen to the 2 different sounds.
Anya, I hate to cut in there. We're running a little over time for you.
Okay. Shoot. Okay, so I basically can use robust principal components analysis to analyze the hum of the hive, and then I can also look at the sparse matrix to see if there's anything interesting. Right now, we're writing an algorithm to detect that queen piping that you just heard. Yeah, so I'll try to wrap it right up. But here's an example of, this is a 21-hour segment, and I'm summarizing the hum of the hive. And so what you can see, obviously here, this is nighttime where things tend to settle down, and you see a lot of noise here. So it turns out that this was a queenless hive. And right at this point, they realized that they didn't have a queen and there was a lot of chaos going on. And then they end up making an emergency queen. I can tell you more about that. We have a paper with some more details. And we'll skip this, even though it's really exciting. Yeah, I'm going to skip it, as much as I hate to. So we're writing an algorithm to be able to detect workers piping or queens piping, because it turns out it's very important. And then the last thing I want to show you is we're also doing some computer vision at the hive. So this is just a few pictures. So here's an example of a video that we take at the entrance of the hive. And again, we use robust principal components analysis to subtract the stationary background. And we do some coloring, obviously, so that we can easily identify the bees. So we didn't have to go through and try to label the bees that we see here. In some cases, it's almost impossible to see them, but robust principal components analysis makes it quite easy for us to see them. And so what we do then is on ESP, which is our streaming solution, we have a technique of finding these little bright spots and then tracking them over time. And so we can tell whether they're coming in or going out. So it's quite exciting work. If anybody has any questions or wants to talk bees, I'd love to talk to you about them any day. And I just wanted to say, if you're interested in bees and you don't feel like getting into becoming a beekeeper, one thing you can do is plant a little pollinator garden, and my bees will be happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anya. And yeah, there's so much more to learn, I'm sure. And so we'll try to get any information you want up on our segment page. And yeah, we really appreciate you coming on the show.
I'll post the link of the paper, the STF paper that we have, and a super demo on the.
Outstanding. Fantastic. Our next speaker is Xan Gregg, who's going to take us through solar farm data. Xan, over to you. And you are muted, unfortunately, Xan. It looks like. Not inside of Zoom, but we're not hearing you. If your headset has a separate Zoom or a mute button, you may want to check on that.
Right, you are. Okay.
There we go. Thanks, Xan.
All right. Thanks, Julian. Okay, well, here's a photo I took from the solar farm a few years ago when I was on a tour. And this is showing the mechanism where the panels rotate through the day. So they're facing east in the morning and straight up at noon and west in the evening. And they have one big axis that they rotate on. So that's going to be important with some of the data I'm going to look at. So let me dive right into that. So one of the great things about having a solar farm is having lots of solar farm data. And this is data collected every 15 minutes. And it's got basically the power. And there's lots of other readings too, but I just boiled it down to the power and also sunshine that I calculated. And you can see this from the header graphs here, a little summary of each column. This data starts in January of 2019 and goes through last week. Very evenly distributed, all times of day, midnight to midnight. So as a result of that, a lot of the power readings are down near zero because we're recording 24 hours a day. And same with sunshine. And we have the two farms that Jerry mentioned. So let's dive right into the data in Graph Builder to look at it, get a graphical view here. I'm just going to take time of day and power just to get a sense of a typical day, or the average day, essentially the average of all the days. Normally, Graph Builder will show you the points as a scatter plot when you first bring it up, but there's so many points here. We've got 90,000 rows, which is not a problem for JMP, but it's a lot to look at. We can turn on the points if you really want to see them, and you can at least make out the profile of the sunniest day, I guess, and there's lots of other cloudy days in between. And I'll switch to a line just to give us that summary. So this is basically showing us the average power for each 15-minute interval. Like I said, we have two farms, so we can look at those side by side. You might remember that Jerry mentioned, let me just overlay them to really compare them. You might remember Jerry mentioned that Solar Farm 1 in blue is 1 megawatt, and the Solar Farm 2 in red is 1.3, so it's expected that it's going to be a bit higher. But this is the average over the whole year, and so we might want to look at more seasonal patterns. So for that, I'm going to try to go down by month. But first, let me just trim out this nighttime that I don't need to waste space on. In JMP, you can just grab the axis and pull it in a little bit to zoom in, or move it around just to customize that to get the area that we're interested in. Now let's get down to month. We don't have month as a variable, but we can right-click on date time and create a month column as a temporary transform column. And we can drag that in and look at all the months side by side. We need to adjust the aspect ratio to make it a little easier to compare. So these are the 15 months or so in our interval. And we can see a couple things here. We can, same pattern as far as farm 1 versus 2. We can see lower values in the winter. Here's December and January, and it gets higher in the warmer weather. But there is a couple odd things like February 2019 and July 2019, where Solar Farm 1 seems to be pretty normal, but Solar Farm 2 is not doing so well. So we can look at that as a little more as we drill down further. I'm going to go down to days, but since we have over 400 days, we can't see them all. So I'm going to take a different strategy. I'm going to filter by the month instead of looking at on the graph. So I'm just going to add a filter. Look at 1 month here, and then I can drag date into into one of the grouping variables. Instead of side by side, though, I'm going to use the wrap group, so they're sort of have a calendar view. So now each graph is a single day, and so we're basically looking at the data unsummarized. We're just seeing one, each point on the line is a single reading for a 15-minute interval. And as a result, this data is much noisier than before, and which is largely, I assume, due to weather. But you do see some smooth curves, which are the completely sunny days. Here we have May. Here's June. One thing interesting to note is how flat the curve is when it is sunny. And that's thanks to that rotation that I pointed out in the first image. So it can, the sunshine would be higher in the center, but because the panels are rotating to track the sun, it has a pretty level output all throughout the day. Here's that July where we saw the drop in Solar Farm 2, and you can see it on the day basis as well. It starts out okay, but then something happens on July 2nd, and it just goes completely offline, and then it comes back at half power and stays that way for most of the month until a few weeks later it gets back up to full power. I asked Jerry about that, and he said there was an inverter problem, and they had to take it offline, and it took a while to get it fully repaired. If we just look at the sunny days, which there aren't that many purely sunny days, go back to that June, we saw that flat image, pretty smooth, and now I'm going to just jump forward to September. As we go through the year into the cooler months, you start to see an interesting pattern emerge. There's December and January. Even on a sunny day, there's always a dip in the middle of the day, and it took me a while to figure out what that was, but it turns out it's also related to that panel rotation. The panels can rotate east to west, but they don't rotate north to south. And in the winter at noon, the sun is more in the south, and so the angle is not as good. So you get less efficient collection of energy. So that's called the winter saddle, Jerry tells me, in the solar industry. So I thought that was an interesting thing to see. All these other non-smooth days, I'm assuming, are related to cloudiness or other environmental conditions. I wanted to dig into that a little bit, and I found a NOAA website that had cloud cover data by the hour. So it's not 15 minutes, but still pretty good. So I was able to use that, interpolate to the 15 minutes, and then sort of calculate sunshine amount. So that's what this column is. And so then we can compare sunshine to the output. And so I've summarized that by day. So now every day is a separate row. I've just got the total power for that day and the total hours of sunshine. So let's see how that correlates. I'm just going to grab power and sunshine, and it looks like it does have a positive correlation. I just sort of see the main trend here. A lot of variation. I'm thinking that might be related to the angle of the sun throughout the year again. So let's try the same technique by looking at a month at a time. Month, year, add that. And I'm just going to sort of step through these months. And there's certainly less variation now. And there's an interesting pattern where they sort of level off after a while, where it's, this is the days with, full sunshine is on the right, and this is like partly cloudy and some clouds, and gets to overcast and completely overcast down here with no sun. But apparently, it looks like with a partly cloudy day, you can still get near the maximum output on the solar farm. I don't know if that's the way the cloudiness was reported or the way the solar panels work. But we see relatively tight. Here's that July issue. It's quite categorically different from the others. But otherwise, most of them follow this pretty good trend. There are a few outliers, like this day in February. And this is the day that Jerry showed earlier, the snow day, or this is actually the day after the snow day. So the day was still fairly sunny, but the power output was a bit low because there was still snow on the solar panels. So I'm going to, fortunately, by some coincidence, Ryan DeWitt, one of our marketing engineers, recorded a video that day. He has a view of the solar farm from his office. And so I'm just going to play that, and there's the farm there. You can sort of see the panels rotating throughout the day and still see the snow on the panels, even though there is a fair amount of sunshine during the day. So I'm just going to let that play me out and hand it back over to you, Julian.
Outstanding. Thanks so much, Xan. Our next speaker, and thank you for sticking with us, is Anderson Mayfield, who's going to take us through exploring the reef. So coral's response to changing environments. So welcome, Anderson.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Just fine.
And can you see my screen?
Yep, perfectly.
Great. Okay, well, let's kick it off. I'm Anderson Mayfield. I'm an assistant scientist at NOAA. I'm actually affiliated with the University of Miami as well. And I just want to say right off the bat that although I work for the US government as a contractor, these are my opinions that I'm going to be sharing. So don't take it as I'm the ambassador of the US government, and because some of the things I'm going to talk about are actually a little bit controversial. So I'm basically going to be talking, it's going to be a little bit of a data light talk. I really want to just let you know kind of the things we coral biologists are doing to study the decline of coral reefs, as well as try to explore areas for hope. And before I get into it, I do want to acknowledge these funding agencies I've thrown up here, just because working with coral reefs tends to be in remote locations, and as a molecular biologist, some of the techniques are expensive. So I've been really fortunate to have these great funding agencies that have supported this work over the last 15 or 20 years. I just want to run through my research interests, because this is basically also going to coincide with the order of the talk. So before things got really bleak for coral reefs, there were those of us who just wanted to study how corals get by on a day-to-day basis, just questions of biological interest. How does the coral work at the cell level? That's really what got me into the field initially. Fact of the matter is, now basically no one is doing this kind of basic biology anymore. Everyone is focusing on what's killing corals. Can we find any strong corals? Are there ways to make corals stronger? These are the topics I'm mainly going to be focusing on for this talk. And this kind of falls under the umbrella of environmental physiology. How do corals respond to changes in their environment? And we do this by looking at field data as well as doing laboratory experiments. What I'm really interested in is what I've called molecular diagnostics. And this is what I probably rely on JMP for most heavily. And this is looking at trying to make predictions based on the environmental data and also the molecular data. So looking at things like biomarkers. Is there something I can measure in a coral that would tell me if it's going to die in the next few weeks? So something like a coral you can kind of think of it as being a coral actuary. So I'm actually not going to talk too much about this today, because I think it's a little bit advanced and I want to give more of a broad overview. But definitely, if you're interested in this line of research using environmental and molecular data to make predictions about animal health, definitely reach out to me via email. I'm also going to try to make it to where these slides are available to everybody as well, if you have any ideas. So really all I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to give you a little bit of background in coral reef biology, just because you're going to need to know a little bit to see why I went about doing things the way I did. I'm going to talk about some problems facing coral reefs. I think most of you are already going to be familiar with them. And I've got kind of a complex flow chart that I'm going to present as kind of how I envision some strategies for moving forward. But since it's Earth Day, and I don't want to just have this be doom and gloom and let you think that all the coral reefs on Earth are dying and will be gone, there are strong corals out there that for some reason don't succumb to the same stressors that typical corals do. So we have a lot of research invested in what's making these corals strong. What can we learn from them? Can we learn something from them that we could use to make other corals stronger? If you want to get any more information on any of this, I encourage you to check out my website, coralreefdiagnostics.com. It's definitely a work in progress, though. So getting into the actual biology, what is a coral reef? My definition is it's just a calcium carbonate or limestone-based structure that's been built by an animal-plant symbiosis. And I'm going to talk about this symbiosis in a minute. They tend to have very high biodiversity, and it makes sense just if you look at this picture. It's one of my favorite reefs that I've been diving on, that we were working at actually in the Maldives. And you could just see this complex structure, so many places for organisms to hide, to mate, to lay their eggs. There's basically a direct correlation between the amount of coral reef structure and the amount of biodiversity. This reef, sadly, is actually almost completely dead now because of rising seawater temperatures, which I'll talk about more in a second. So this reef that you see in the prior slide is based on a symbiosis between an animal and a plant. The animal being the coral, which is a cnidarian. It's a simple invertebrate with special stinging cells called nematocytes, or nematocysts, I should say, with these dinoflagellates that actually live inside of the coral cell. So they're not just floating around in the coral tissues, kind of like our gut bacteria. They're localized. They're completely ensheathed in the coral cell. So if you look at a coral cell under the microscope, which I think I have some pictures of later, you'll see that they occupy almost 90 or 95% of the volume of the coral. This is important because these dinoflagellates are photosynthetically active, and they don't use all of the photosynthate that they fix. They translocate or transfer a good portion of it, even sometimes 100% of it, to their coral host. So the coral has specialized feeding cells to harpoon prey, but they don't actually need to eat all the time. They can rely on photosynthesis from their symbionts. So this makes the coral kind of a physiological oxymoron. It's an animal that can photosynthesize, or it's an animal that's acquired the capacity for photosynthesis through symbiosis. And this is very obvious when you look at a coral up close. We call this an endosymbiosis because it's intracellular. We also refer to this as a mutualism, because not only does the coral receive the benefit of energy and fixed carbon from the symbionts, but it's actually providing nutrients, shelter, things like that for its symbionts. We actually refer to these as Symbiodinaceae, the dinoflagellates. This is the family name. I'm going to try to use the more colloquial terms, dinoflagellate and algae, throughout the talk, just so you don't get confused. But if you look at a coral by biomass at the molecular level, which are the things that interest me, it's about 2/3 animal, 1/3 plant. And it's actually even more complicated than that, because it's not just the coral, it's not just the dinoflagellates. There's a whole microbial consortium that associates with almost all corals: bacteria, viruses, single cell fungi, things like that. And it's my firm belief that if you want to make predictions about the health of the coral, you need to think about the individual health of all players as well as how they interact with each other. And I would hope this kind of sounds like a no-brainer, but it's a controversial topic in the coral field. And I think most people don't like this idea because it means more work. I'm only interested in the coral. Why can't I just focus on the coral? I'm only interested in the dinoflagellates. Why can't I just ignore the coral for now? I think, science is inherently reductionistic, and depending on your question, you could get away with this approach. But for people like me who are interested in diagnostics, health, predictive modeling, you need to know what all the players of this association are doing. So it's not really debated among us marine biologists what's the biggest threat to coral reefs. We know it's climate change. This is not to say that every reef on Earth is most threatened by climate change. There's certainly reefs near population centers, for instance, large population centers, that are more threatened by pollution, development, things like that. But on a global scale, it's the rising temperatures. Corals live near the upper threshold of their thermotolerance. What this means is if the temperature just gets 1 or 2 degrees C hotter than what they normally see in a year for a sustained amount of time, typically days to weeks, you can think about that beautiful reef I showed you earlier, go to something like this. These corals have lost their symbionts. They've lost the ability to photosynthesize. They're probably going to starve to death. This is a particularly sad picture because this was thought to be the world's last quote unquote pristine coral reef in the middle of the Indian Ocean. There's no other stressors, only climate change. There's no people, there's no overfishing, no pollution, no disease. We kind of thought, maybe naively, that this reef would have fared the best. Hey, you're only succumbing to one stressor, temperature increases. That means you should better be able to ward this off than a reef that has maybe temperature and water pollution. It ends up being the complete opposite. It's the marginal reefs, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that have already been adapted to these crazy conditions. They're the ones that are basically going to fare the best. And this is the kind of intimidating flow chart I alluded to. We're not going to go through all of it. Don't feel like you need to take it in. All I want you to know is basically it starts at the top left where I have mitigate environment. That's the best case scenario. As you work your way through this kind of a choose your own adventure towards the bottom right, that's kind of like it becomes more of a last ditch effort. And we're going to talk about some of the themes in here today. First of all, I don't, in an ideal world, I wouldn't need to do any kind of experimental biology to try to save corals. We would just mitigate the environment, curb carbon emissions, all the things we know that need to be done. We could even work at local scales, reduce pollution, try to reduce some of these local impacts. And this is something I think we can do. But as a kind of a pessimist, I have to kind of prepare for the worst. So, all right, let's hope that we don't need to do any of these dramatic measures that I'm going to broach to save corals. But we want to have them in our pocket just in case we're not able to mitigate environments. We could start to explore some really crazy ideas if we can't mitigate the environments or curb carbon emissions, slow the rate of temperature increase. We could actually move corals out of the ocean. I mean, this is not going to be practical on a scale of the Great Barrier Reef. You're not going to take the Great Barrier Reef inside. That's ridiculous. But if you identify some, say species that are on the verge of extinction due to climate change, do we even have the capacity to keep them alive in captivity? And you might be surprised to learn that the answer is basically no. There's very few research aquaria or public aquaria on Earth that are really good at farming corals. Thankfully, I had the privilege of working at one of the few, which is the National Aquarium of Taiwan. So we've basically been trying to promote these ideas of how to keep corals alive in captivity if it really got that bad. We basically developed a coral hospital where we would take sick corals in off the reef, diagnose them, that being kind of where I would come in, because being my major interest, treat them. You could treat them with antibiotics if they're sick. You could treat them with antioxidants. This is all very new ideas, and I don't think there's a single paper that's shown experimentally with data coral convalescence that you've actually nursed corals back to health. We've tried it, we've done it, but it's still very preliminary. But I would like to think that we would at least have the science available to go through this process. Because if you rehabilitated a coral, you could actually propagate it and make more corals. I didn't mention it, but corals are colonies of polyps. They're all genetically identical. So if you were to make a strong coral, you could basically propagate it. And this is known as coral restoration, and I'll talk about that in a second. Another thing you could do is if you weren't able to mitigate the environment, you could go out there and try to find corals that are resilient, even in the face of these deteriorating conditions. And we found this in Taiwan, but also where I'm working now in Miami. The Port of Miami, this is the project of my collaborator, Dr. Ian Enox. They've found all these really healthy brain corals living in basically the Port of Miami. The water is dirty, it's hot, it's murky, it can be stagnant. This is not a place where we'd expect to find healthy corals. These are probably, I would say, the healthiest corals in South Florida. They've been spared from disease and climate change impacts that have killed other corals. What can we learn? What are these corals doing differently? We have a postdoc dedicated to this project now. And maybe these are the best corals for reseeding other reefs. These corals are really strong. Maybe we should fragment them and move them somewhere else. And this is an active area of research called reef restoration that I actually used to be opposed to. Because the idea was, let's fragment corals, grow them in a nursery. The nursery can be in the ocean or in an aquarium, and let's put them back out on a reef and make farm our own reef. And I was always scratching my head thinking, why are you going to put corals back out in a place where they've been proven to not do well? The fact that you're needing to replant corals somewhere should imply that that ecosystem was not suitable for corals. But that's assuming you don't do something to the corals to make them stronger. You could take them from one of these resilient reefs, or you could actually take corals that maybe aren't that resilient and make them stronger. And this is something that we've been experimenting with over the last decade. And it kind of stemmed from work that we were doing in southern Taiwan. So I used to work at this marine lab. I have labeled it as NMMBA. It's the National Aquarium of Taiwan. And it was next to this little bay called Ho Wan that had a very nice little coral reef. We did most of our field work, though, here down in the south, Nan Wan Bay, which is in the Luzon Strait. It had some of the most beautiful coral reefs in Taiwan, but the curious thing is it's where the world's strongest upwelling occurs. And what that is you've got this cold, deep ocean water that comes into these shallow reefs and basically cools them off in the summer. So that is a good thing for the corals. It's basically preventing them from bleaching. You also can notice in some of these days in June and May and July, you've got fluctuations from 29 to 30 Celsius in a day. This is unheard of for coral reefs to undergo that dramatic of a fluctuation, but it's the nicest, healthiest reefs in the country. Whereas in Ho Wan, it's much more of, I'm showing the data now for the non-upwelling reefs, or in the Taiwan Strait, you don't see these kind of dramatic temperature fluctuations. This is a normal temperature profile for a coral reef in the coral triangle. 22, 23 degrees Celsius, so mid 70s, low 70s in the winter, up to around 29, 30 in the summer. So we had an idea, all right, let's try to uncover why these corals can live in these extremely variable conditions. We found in another series of studies, and this has been reconfirmed elsewhere, that corals living at variable temperature regimes also do better at experimentally elevated temperatures. So we wanted to know what's going on in these corals. So we took the corals from the upwelling reef, which I'll refer to as Hobihu, and we exposed them to variable temperature conditions to simulate upwelling. We also took corals from the non-upwelling reef, Ho Wan, and exposed them to these same variable temperature conditions. These corals would never experience those kind of fluctuating temperatures in situ. And then we did kind of the control crosses where we have upwelling corals exposed to variable temperatures, non-upwelling corals exposed to stable temperatures, with the basic idea being, all right, if you expose corals to their native temperature conditions, they're going to do better. That should be kind of a no-brainer. We used these mini coral reefs we were growing inside. They actually allow the corals to feed, so corals tend to do a lot better in them. We used this coral called Seriatopora hystrix. It's one of the most common corals in Asia. It also tends to be environmentally sensitive most places, but not in Taiwan. And the stable treatment was at 26 degrees Celsius, very typical reef coral reef temperature. The variable one fluctuating from 23 to 29 degrees Celsius. So it pretty much turned out as we expected. The upwelling reef corals exposed to variable temperatures, they did the best. You expose them to their native temperature conditions, they did better. They were photosynthesizing more, they were growing faster. At the time, though, we couldn't afford to do the profiling of anything going on in the cells. We just didn't have the money, we didn't have the technology, but I sent these samples to a sequencing facility and told them to keep them in the freezer, that I would eventually have the money. And I basically had an editorial service, not an editorial service, I would edit papers for people and review papers for journals, and I would ask them to kindly make a charitable donation to the sequencing facility. So over the years, as I've edited and reviewed more papers, send money to the facility, and I get data. It's actually been great. I got some data last week because the labs in Taiwan, unlike those in Miami, they're still open, so I can still get data coming through the pipeline. And I'm going to share some of those data today. So we found that basically, I didn't show the slides, but these variable temperature corals also did well at really high temperatures. I had a couple of papers come out on this. So we decided to take this idea and apply it to some of these really puny Florida corals. This is known as staghorn coral or Acropora. We basically exposed it to variable temperature conditions, 28 to 31 C twice a day for 3 months. And then we had some controls that didn't get this treatment. And then after that 3-month period, we did a high temperature stress study. We took a temperature we basically knew would kill them. And we were able to double the lifespan. So the corals that got this pre-treatment at variable temperatures lived 2 times longer than the ones that didn't. So this is exciting. It will probably get good press. It will make a nice paper. But in the end, all those corals still died. So we were able to stress harden these corals by exposing them to variable temperatures, but not enough to where I honestly think they would survive in the wild. As a physiologist, I'm still interested, though, what was going on inside of the cells of these animals that allowed them to live at these variable temperatures. So this is what all the data I'm talking about in this talk was anything I uncovered was done through JMP. I switched to JMP Pro about a year ago, and that was a real game changer. And the speed with which I'm able to go from my, in this case, protein sequencing data to getting publication quality data and figures is literally a day. This is mind-blowing. This is something that, messing around in an Excel spreadsheet, for instance, could have taken months of work. And I've got a pipeline now where I can basically get the file from the protein sequencing facility, known as the mass spectrometer, and get some of these data I'm going to show you in a day. And I'm not going to go through the pipeline just because I'm running short on time, but I'd definitely be happy to talk to other people, particularly people working on molecular biology, because I think this is particularly powerful. So looking at some of the proteins in these corals that were exposed to these variable temperature conditions, this is backtracking to the Taiwan samples. About half of them are from the symbiont, half are from the host. So I expected it to be in that kind of more traditional 2-to-1 ratio. It's a little bit symbiont heavy, and that to me in and of itself is interesting. Here's looking at the proteins that were actually differentially regulated by variable temperatures, and I want to focus attention on panel B. This is a symbiont protein. So actually both A and B were the two most interesting proteins that were basically under differential regulation of variable temperatures, both from the symbiont. So this is getting back to what I was harping on earlier. Hey, if you want to know how the coral responds to temperature changes or more generally its health, you need to focus on multiple players. Both of these proteins were higher when corals were exposed to their native conditions, and both of them are involved in Golgi trafficking. And we know actually a lot about Golgi trafficking. This is basically the process by which lipids get moved around the cell. And then this one is particularly involved in lipid secretion. And we know that lipids get migrated from the symbionts to the host. So this is giving us a fruitful hypothesis for understanding mechanisms of acclimation. It's something to do with lipid trafficking within the symbionts. And this isn't just interesting for the sake of the basic biology, the fundamental cell biology. Now that we know the genetic basis of stress hardening in these corals, this is in the symbionts. We can culture these. We can modify their genomes with things like CRISPR. We can actually go in there and try to reprogram them to differentially modulate this protein to make them stronger. And this is what my late PhD supervisor, Ruth Gates, was doing before she passed away. They were basically trying to make designer genetically modified corals, but at that time, they didn't know the genetic basis of coral thermotolerance. They were just doing it by crossbreeding strong corals willy-nilly. But now we have the capacity to crossbreed and modify the genomes, and we're starting to have a handle with these new protein data on what makes coral symbionts stronger. We can start to really make strides in trying to genetically modify or breed stronger corals. So I want to leave you with some conclusions. The first being there are some tools that exist that we can use to biopreserve corals, although I'm hoping we won't actually need them. The best case scenario is stabilize the climate to where the temperature rise slows down. I didn't really mention it, but I think it's been stated already. It's not so much the maximum temperature we're worried about, it's the speed at which it's rising. We can biobank corals. Obviously, this is only going to work on small scales. We're not going to be able to take the Caribbean coral reefs inside. We can stress harden them. We can modify their physiology, outplant them, genetically modify them. This is a non-exhaustive list of the tools at our disposal, but it's just some of the things that I've been working on. And then I didn't mention, but we do have the capacity, if everything really fails, we basically can freeze the gametes and hope that, we can thaw them out in the future once the climate stabilizes and then go from there. So that's the end of my talk, and I apologize. That's probably not too much time for questions, but I'd be happy to entertain any if possible.
Thank you so much, Anderson. What we'll do, since we're short on time, is why don't we direct those questions over to the segment page that we'll build that for you on our user community. And just a reminder to anyone on community.jump.com/jumponair, and you can get in touch with Anderson. Anderson, thank you so much. Such important work, and I always love hearing you talk. Thank you. Our next speaker is Linda Kelly from the carbonfund.org Foundation. She's going to be talking to us about going carbon neutral. Linda.
Great. Thank you, Julian. Are you able to view my screen? Have I shared successfully?
Not yet. I can see your video, but not your screen yet.
Okay. Let's see. Let's do that again. How we doing? We get it done now?
Yep. There it is.
Okay,
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you for including me in this Earth Day celebration. I'm very pleased to be representing carbonfund.org Foundation. We're a 17-year-old 501c3 nonprofit formed by a husband and wife team who had the vision to make it very simple and very affordable for businesses and organizations of all sizes and in all industries and individuals to assess their carbon footprint, look for ways to reduce that footprint, and then for those that wanted to neutralize the negative environmental impact of their footprint, make donations through Carbon Fund, which we use to support third-party validated and verified carbon offset projects around the world. So I'm going to begin by just a quick overview of very easy ways that individuals can come to our website and understand the impact of their carbon footprint. We have a lot of estimated preset options for offsetting carbon emissions from things like driving your car or traveling, which of course we're not doing much of these days, from the emissions from your home, and then from attending events. So looking at some of the examples of ways that we recommend carbon emission footprint reductions, on each of these pages you'll find some very simple tips. And while at present we all probably have record low, dramatically lower carbon footprints, this is a wonderful time to really understand the easy, simple steps that you can take to reduce your own carbon footprint and put these practices into place so that as we return to life as usual, you've got your carbon footprint a little bit further under control. So you can see some of the very simple suggestions that we make about what you can do around your own home. And then I'm going to bounce back to vehicles. I'm not doing a lot of air travel these days. And look also at those examples of ways that you can look to reduce your carbon footprint. It's as simple as improving your driving habits, making sure your car is well maintained, making sure your tires are in the proper air pressures, etc., and then looking for the most fuel efficient vehicles you can find. So very simple ways for individuals to come to the website, learn about their carbon footprint, and then take action to reduce and offset it. For businesses, we do an awful lot of custom calculations of business emissions, and that's something for which Carbon Fund doesn't charge. We consider that part of our nonprofit educational mission. But for a business that wants to come get an idea of their carbon footprint, they can come to our business calculator. And again, this takes the basic areas of carbon emissions for a business, the electricity and heat from any facilities, any vehicular travel, whether that be business travel or employee commuting, business air travel, rail travel, product shipment, and attending of events. And again, these are very kind of simple and high level calculations for an organization to come on to the website and just get a very general sense for some of their overall operating emissions. And again, we work with a lot of companies then to drill down much deeper and refine these calculations. So once a carbon footprint's been assessed, and once you've done everything that you can to reduce that carbon footprint, should you wish to neutralize the negative impacts of your carbon footprint, you can make donations through Carbon Fund that go to support third-party, validated and verified voluntary carbon offset projects. And these projects fall into three general categories, and I'm just going to show you a quick example of each. An energy efficiency category relies on some type of technology that's been created that simply is able to conduct the same work using less energy. And the truck stop electrification project is one that I think is very understandable. These are installations at various U.S. truck stops. And as you can see, there's sort of a flexible HVAC tube. And the long haul trucker pulls up to this installation and pulls a small electrical panel that's at the end of that HVAC tube into the cab. And then the trucker is able to plug anything that he or she needs into this electrical panel, whether it's to charge a phone, a computer, run a heating system, run a cooling system, and turn off their diesel engine. If you've ever pulled into a truck stop, you hear the diesel engines idling, you're aware of the odor and the air pollution and the noise pollution that's caused. And this technology not only reduces the carbon emissions, but also improves the resting circumstances for the driver and the noise and air pollution there at the truck stop. A second category is forestry or land conservation projects. And Carbon Fund has been directly involved in establishing 4 different projects in the western state of Acre, Brazil. These are Amazonian rainforest conservation projects. And most of us understand the critical importance of preserving the Amazonian rainforest, the lungs of the earth, in a concentrated area with more flora and fauna than any other area per hectare or square mile. And these projects not only are conserving the rainforest from being used for other purposes, whether it be for timbering, agricultural grazing, or livestock grazing, but they're also conducting very important work such as biodiversity monitoring of threatened and endangered species and improving the local living conditions for the local communities, involving them in the forest conservation efforts, teaching them sustainable agricultural methods, and we've built health clinics and schools and sanitary facilities for those communities along these properties. And the renewable energy category is probably the biggest and the most general. This is, everything that you would understand and expect: wind farms, solar arrays, and small hydroelectric power plants that are, again, generating electricity at a lower carbon emissions rate than you would find with a fossil fuel powered operation. And all the carbon offset projects that Carbon Fund supports have to meet the highest standards for voluntary carbon offset projects. And these are established by various internationally recognized organizations that create their standards. And then there's a third-party scientific assessment of the firm to meet those standards of the project by an outside firm that not only confirms that the project meets all of the standards of the requirements of the standards, but then also periodically re-verifies the project to confirm that the project's continuing to do all the things it needs to be doing. And that's the point at which the project's results are calculated, and the quantity of carbon dioxide that's been avoided, sequestered, or reduced is calculated so that the quantity of carbon offsets available to be sold are confirmed for that particular project. And the sale of the carbon offsets is what funds the projects, not only their creation, but their ongoing operational costs. So that's a little bit about what we do for carbon offset footprint analyses and helping individuals and businesses understand it. I do also want to show you quickly. We also support tree planting projects. And so I'll finish up quickly just by saying in honor of Earth Day, we do have a tree planting campaign ongoing. We are matching every $50 donation to plant 50 trees, so that a $50 donation now plants 100 trees for Earth Day. So if you'd like to join with us to celebrate Earth Day, we certainly would welcome you to do that. And Julian, that is my presentation.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Linda. And that's a really great program. We'll make sure that we share the link for that tree planting program with our attendees. So thank you so much, Linda.
Very good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Our next speaker is Dan Valenti, back on the program to take us through analyzing air quality improvements. Dan?
Thank you, Julian. Hi. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on in the last month or so to take a look at collecting some data that's been available and publishing it to Jump Public. So in our family of products, if you're familiar with Jump, Jump Pro, Jump Clinical, and Jump Genomics, you might not know that we have a new one that came out with our last version of Jump, and that's Jump Live. It's an online website where you can share your Jump discoveries with others. And it's part of the end-to-end analytic workflow in Jump. So getting Jump data into Jump from almost everywhere, getting access to this data, doing some work to shape and pre-process that, ultimately making some visualizations which highlight what's in those data, building some models, organizing those discoveries, and finally sharing those with others that need to make decisions. And we've had lots of tools in Jump for sharing your discoveries with those that don't have Jump, things like our PowerPoint export and interactive HTML, our high resolution graphics, for example. But with Jump Public and Jump Live, we've got a new way to share those results with others that preserves a lot of the signature functionality and exploratory data analysis tools like the local data filter and column switcher that are part of Jump. So, and how would you use Jump Live? So we've got lots of use cases. So collaborating with colleagues worldwide while preserving security while you're sharing those data. For R&D, sharing results with internal and external audiences in a single unifying platform. Monitoring things like online processes and publishing routine dashboards in an automated fashion. And ultimately for those consumers, it helps them make data-driven decisions with the interactive and customized data filters. So how does this relate to the problem that I'm looking at? Well, we get lots of requests from customers saying, how do I test Jump Live? We don't have Jump Live yet in our organization. We have a free version of Jump Live available in Jump Public, and any Jump user can publish public data to Jump Public and try that out. So, and when I'm thinking of testing these out, you might ask yourself these questions. What types of data do you need to routinely monitor and share with others? And how can I test that with the free and public available data that many sources have available? So let's look at this dashboard that I've published on Jump Public. And what I'd like to do is walk us through the workflow of how I keep this updated. So the EPA publishes a data set, or lots of different data, but the one that I was interested in is the specific pollutants. I've been looking at the PM 2.5, so these are the smallest particles that are in the air. And I was interested in looking at how the air quality in a state like California that had pretty strict shelter-in-place orders at a current time, and see if we could look at monitoring how that PM 2.5 level has changed over the course of the weeks and months that ultimately there's a lot fewer people traveling, fewer people on the road, people working from home. So it would be kind of an interesting data set to look at and update on Jump Public. So again, here's my dashboard on Jump Public. I've got a bubble plot, and if we start this going, I'm looking at all of the data from 2019 and then move into 2020. So if we move and we start, here's the beginning of January, and we can see, that you're still getting some reading sites that are into the moderate and unhealthy for sensitive groups. And then if we speed this up a little bit, around about the beginning of March, you'll start to see a lot smaller bubbles, and overall there are fewer sites that are hitting that moderate. And then we've restarted here in January. Got another way of looking at this that I'm monitoring, and that's a time series of all of our sensor sites. So all of the sites have their individual measurements, and this is kind of a spaghetti plot, but I've got here a reference line where that stay-at-home order started, and we can see at certain times of the year we get these levels that go up into the moderate toward dangerous for sensitive groups. And we have a relatively small sample here, but I'll keep pulling these data, and we'll look at what all of these sensor sites look at in the future. Another way that I'm looking at this is just a heat map that is colored by our different AQI categories. And then finally, I've got a way to look at some box plots by quarter where you can drill down into a specific county. So I'm looking at LA County here and what our air quality is has been in the second quarter. So how do I go about updating this? Right, so the first thing I need to do is I have to download data from EPA, and I can pick the pollutant that I'm interested in, the PM 2.5. I want to grab 2020, and then we'll grab California, and it'll go ahead and give me a CSV file of all of the monitor sites. So I can open that up in JMP and concatenate it with my other historical data. Got a folder here, and what I will do is open this up in JMP, and then we're going to go ahead and save this as the updated 2020 data. So now this has all of the 2020 data to date. I can delete my old file and then put my new one in there. Now what I'll do is I have a little script here. We'll open the 2019 data, 2020 data, and then we'll just go ahead and concatenate those two together. So now we have all of the data current to 421. Now, in order to make those graphs, I want to create some features in JMP in the data table that I don't have. So I don't have the actual air quality category or the color label, and that's a function that we've written to add that in. So I pulled from Wikipedia. If we go from the United States, there are levels, a 24-hour reading of the PM 2.5, and I have a different level there and what category it can be. So we can do that with a formula in JMP, and so I have a script that does that, and it'll create a new column for me and look at that 24-hour and then give me that category in that column there. I also was looking at year quarter, so I want to add those columns in from the date. So this is creates the year quarter for me, and then the overall year. So we've got this data set to kind of where I'm ready to build the graphs that I'm interested in. And now let's rebuild all four of those graphs that we had in the JMP public dashboard. So here's our bubble plot now with the new data, the line chart of all of the sites, the heat map, and then finally the box plots with that local data filter. So we have all of our scripts that we've built, and we're ready to go ahead and publish those to JMP Live. And for that, I'm actually using a publish script. So when I'm doing this on a regular basis, I don't need to manually step through all of these processes. I also have a couple of other things that I do in the script that make sharing these data with others easier. So let's go into our script. It's going to do the same thing, open the data tables, concatenate them together. Here's where I create all of my new features. This is exactly what I just did interactively. So it'll step through and create those columns for me. Now, for the graphs, what I actually do is I want to create scripts into the data table of the graphs so that if somebody downloads my data from JMP Public, they can see that all of the graphs that are in JMP Public can be run within JMP. So what this part of the script does is it writes those scripts to the data table so that you can run them and have those. If you want to explore these data, maybe you don't like the graphs that I built, you want to try to build your own. So this would at least give you the starting point. Then finally, the last bit here is just the publishing and updating the report to JMP Public. So we create our four graphs by running those scripts in the data table, create a web report, give it a title and give it that source data so people can click through and see where the data is coming from. I'm going to give each of the graphs that are in my JMP Public report a title, and then finally publish this to JMP Public, replacing that package in the process. So when we run this, it'll go ahead and create all those graphs for me, collect those up into a package, which is going to be published to Jump Public. And then we'll see, once this is all packaged up and published to Jump Public, we'll see that report in Jump Public has been updated now with data that's current to today. Just take one more second here. And here we go. So now we have that same outdoor air quality data. It's still the same URL, so if people have shared it or clicked through from other links, they can see it. But now we've got data that's up to the date. So this is kind of the process by which you keep a Jump Live or Jump Public dashboard up to date. I'm using kind of a hybrid approach. I can pull the data down very easily from a CSV file, and then it's just a few steps to get that updated. Now, if these data were coming in at a much faster rate, if they were every 5 minutes or something, I would probably look to see if I could use an API to pull those data from this website more automatically. But for a daily refresh or a couple-day refresh, this is a workflow that works pretty well. So it's a quick overview of how you can create a dashboard that updates pretty regularly on Jump Public. And there's lots of interesting data to explore, and I hope you have a chance to explore some public data and publish your own dashboards to Jump Public. Thank you.
Outstanding, Dan. And I hope you'll share that script with our attendees here on the user community, community.jump.com/jumponair. I'm sure many people would love to see how you did that. In our final segment, I'm really excited that we have Kelsey here, Senior Manager of Advanced Analytics, R&D here at Jump, to talk about plant breeding with our Jump Genomics product. Kelsey? And Kelsey, we're not hearing or seeing you yet. Oh, I think I just heard you.
Okay. Can you see me? There we go.
Yes.
Gotta start the video. All right. Thank you, Julian. And you got me really excited at the beginning of this segment that I thought we were going to have a goat on our Zoom. So, I tried to decide. Sorry. I know. So I embedded a live feed to a goat farm, and I've been watching them play all day while you guys were talking, and now they're all asleep, I guess. So no goats, still no goats for our presentation today. Goats' life is demanding, and farmers' lives are demanding. There's no time like Earth Day, I think, to say thank you to our farmers. I actually grew up on a farm, didn't look quite as nice as this one. And so if my mom's listening, thank you for the hard work. It's very demanding right now, especially as we continually ask our growers to make more with less land and for more people. So one of the ways that plant scientists are meeting this demand is with methods that are from data science. And one of the methods I wanted to share with you today are some of the algorithms we've put into our Jump Genomics product to do genomic selection in plant breeding. And the idea here is that we want to take the genetic variability that's natural in plants and use that mixed with machine learning to build predictive models that will help us select the best crosses or the most promising crosses to make in a breeding experiment, and hopefully can balance multiple traits at once while doing so. The highlighting example that I want to show today is a nonprofit collaboration project that we're really excited to be a part of called Rich Oats for Africa. And the idea here is that they're looking to take wild varieties of oats that have higher nutrient density and adapt them into growing conditions in malnourished areas of Africa. You've all heard of what hidden hunger is. It's this idea that children may feel full, but they're actually starving because they have nutrient deficiencies because the food they're eating isn't nutritious enough. So when we're doing plant science experiments and increasing yield, we have to make sure that we don't decrease other important aspects like nutrition. The data that I'm sharing today is an example training set where we have 88 rows. Each row is an oat variety, or a line, as they call it. And then we have several traits here from about 10 different traits, agronomic traits, that we've measured on these different varieties. For the demo today, I'm going to focus on these three: crown rust, yield, and beta-glucan. Crown rust is a disease that happens to oat, so we can think of that as disease. Yield, we all know and know is important, that we want to increase yield. And beta-glucan is a soluble fiber and is one of the reasons that oats are considered such a healthy, nutritious food. So we want to increase beta-glucan where we can in varieties. Just looking at a scatter plot of the relationships between these three traits, luckily we can see if we were creating breeding experiments that would maximize or increase yield, we're already getting lucky that that naturally means a decrease in disease. But selecting those lines that are high yielding with low disease really doesn't help us at all with increasing the nutrition benefit of the lines we select. So what we want to do is use the genetic variations, and in this case we have about 1,400 genetic markers or DNA loci coded as 0, 1, 2, representing variation in their genetic code. And we want to use those 1,400 markers to build predictive models for the three traits that we're interested in. So how do we do this? So our workflow for genomic selection within JMP Genomics has several steps to it, and I'm going to go high level and skip over some. But basically, we want to understand the association. So we might start with just a single association test. This is very common in genetic studies. It's called a GWAS, Genome-Wide Association Scan. And the idea is that we want to test every single genetic marker, DNA marker we have, with the traits that we're interested in and understand the singular associations with the three traits. So we can see the health benefits, beta-glucan. These are pretty marginal significance. So it looks like we're going to have a harder time building a strong predictive model there. But with crown rust, with our disease and yield, we have some good hits showing that there is some heritability towards building a predictive model with these. One thing that's important when you're trying to do genomic selection, balancing multiple traits at the same time, is you have to know that you have genetic markers that can be driven in one direction. So here's a quick Venn diagram showing the significant associations for each of the genetic markers for each of the traits. So what we can see is that there are still several hundred markers that are kind of uniquely associated to each of the three traits we might be interested in maximizing or minimizing in a breeding experiment. So this gives us some good idea that we won't have competing markers to drive different traits in different directions. So the real magic of genomic selection comes in model building and model assessment. So we used here, I'm going to skip over the heavy lifting parts of that, but we used the JMP Genomics Predictive Modeling Reveal Builder, which allows you to assess and fit a library of different models, different flavors of models, change the way you might filter out certain genetic variants that will be used in that model. And then we can use a cross-validation scheme in order to pick the very best models for each of the traits. So here's a quick graph showing the assessment of a 5-fold cross-validation, looking at the model criteria, just correlation between the predicted versus the observed values for each of our three traits: our health benefit, beta-glucan, our disease, crown rust, and our yield. For each of the three traits, we tried 3 different models, and we did 5 iterations of that to get a kind of a distribution of how well each model can fit. And we see boosted trees didn't seem to perform well. This RR-BLUP is a very common genomic selection model that's based on ridge regression, a penalized regression model. And we did 2 flavors of that here, one fitting all 1,400 markers and another with about 180, a subset of clustered, highly significant markers. The idea there being is that often a simpler model, if it performs well, is much easier to use going forward through genotyping generations in a genomic selection methodology. So once we've built our model and we have for each model trained a model, we want to use the score formulas in order to apply that model to potential cross outcomes. So we take those 88 lines, those oat lines that we have. Well, it's impossible for land use, for time, to make all 88 crosses, all potential pairwise crosses. So what we want to do is analytically derive, using the trained model, the score formula, apply that model to analytically derive the potential outcome of making those 88 times choose 2 crosses. So this is showing a distribution where each point represents a cross of those 88 lines. And here we're just looking at the averages of scoring the potential cross for our 3 traits of interest. Now here's where you can start playing and really finding ways to use your model to select the best crosses. So we can increase our score beta-glucan value, our nutrition. We can not do that. We can decrease our disease. And of course, we still want high-yielding plants so that they grow well and grow a lot. So just like that, we've taken those predictive model scores, we've trained the model and applied those scores to our potential crosses, and we've come up with some promising crosses we might want to make. Just based on the selections, we see some lines already really showing promise to be good lines. So oat 24, 48, 22. What that means here, because this is conditionally filtering, those are lines that appear often in the crosses we've now selected based on our thresholds. So we can take these crosses now and go to the next step, which is progeny simulation, simulating what their offspring would look like. So here's the result of a first generation or 1 generation of a progeny simulation. We took some of the selected promising crosses that we might make in a breeding experiment, and now we can actually simulate using the genetic map what their outcomes, what their progeny or offspring might actually look like. So for each of the crosses, we simulated 75 progeny or offspring. And now we can score again with that model to get an understanding of the estimate of how those progenies will perform with our 3 traits. One of the plots I like a lot, because I like a lot of color maybe, is this ordered heat map. So as we make 75 progeny crosses, of course, there's always a chance that we might get a really high value, but how common is it given the genetic variability? So this kind of gives you a density of how often the offspring had a value of interest. So what I'm hovering over right now is cross 22 with 48. And about 30 of the progeny of that set out of 75 had pretty good high nutritive content. And by selecting it, you can also see that it had pretty low disease and was one of the best, highest performing yield as well. So right off the bat, we've taken the models we've built, we've scored and evaluated potential crosses and used that to select a smaller subset and can simulate progeny to see what would happen. But we can actually automate this into a multi-generational process as well. So the true what if could be simulating that outcome. And here we're using optimization algorithms that are provided by the SAS OR team here at SAS. Our operations research team is one of the best. And what we're doing at each generation or progeny simulation is using optimization to select the best progeny based on maximizing yield and beta-glucan, nutritional benefit, while minimizing disease. So the results of this multi-generation simulation, again, I like the color plots. We use these and we call these sometimes caterpillar plots, because they kind of climb up. So what we're looking at here is the results of 4 generations of potential breeding. And so if, for example, that one that's doing probably the best in terms of nutritional benefit, 22 with line 24, it doesn't really decrease our disease very well, and it's kind of middle of the road with yield. But if we look again at that cross that was already showing some promise in our first progeny simulation, oat 22 with oat 48, that cross in 4 generations, you can see that it's increasing beta-glucan, drastically reduced the disease, and is one of still the highest performing yields, showing us that from the genetic potential, there is variability that we can maximize to drive these new varieties in the directions of the traits of interest that we need. So, all right, so that was quick, but that was kind of a high-level overview of how we've been building tools with JMP Genomics in order to do these kind of breeding experiments and give you that what-if answer in hours instead of 4 years. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Julian.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Kelsey. And we'll be sure to include any links you provided us in the segment page for everyone to check out, because I know we have some other webinars and other materials people who are interested in genomics can look at. So that's a good time as any to mention community.jump.com/jumponair. That's where you'll be able to find the links that we mentioned for any of our segments. We hope that going forward, you check out the Jump Forward magazine, jump.com/forward. I mentioned that at the starter program. That's where you can download the PDF of our really amazing magazine, and we really encourage you to take a look at that. Be sure to follow us on all of our different social media channels. Check out your programming guide. We have a great show for you on Friday that I promise will run a little bit shorter than 3 hours. Share us with your colleagues. Jump.com/JOA is the link to share, and we do hope to see you Friday. But until then, we hope you stay safe. We hope you stay healthy. We hope you stay close, even as you're keeping your distance. Take care, everyone, and happy Earth Day.